Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 46, Wounds. Tatsuki wasn't sure how long it took for her guide to lead her outside of the underground tunnel, but she was pretty sure it had been several hours. After being silenced twice in a rather rude manner after attempting to start conversation, she'd just decided to stay silent instead, trying to think of the best and most concise way she could explain her presence, although the occasional whispers in her head that kept suggesting she was going to make a mess out of it made the effort particularly difficult. Eventually, Kyokaku guided her up a stairway to a door that opened into a living area where a tall young man with chin-length black hair and the muscled build of a fighter, wearing a set of green clothes including a vest, scarf, bandana, and even a pair of goggles. He jerked up suddenly in shock as the door opened, letting out a high-pitched screech before seeming to calm down upon recognizing Kyokaku and saying, placing a hand on his chest as if to help himself regain control. "Sister. I didn't know you'd taken the secret passage. Knock before entering next time." This apparently annoyed the one-armed woman, for she shouted back, sounding angry. "This is my house, you parasite. I can come and go whenever I want. Now make yourself useful and prepare some tea for my guest, or I'll kick you out." The man seemed very cowed, although Tatsuki wasn't sure what to make of the exchange. It seemed weird for siblings to act like that, but then again, she'd seen Ichigo's family and they were weird in their own way, and while what little she remembered of Orium's brother had painted him as responsible, her friend took care of making that particular relationship strange all on her own, so maybe it was just the way siblings worked. As a lone child, she wouldn't know. She shook her head, pushing the thought away, when Kyokaku motioned for her to sit down and said, her tone back to a more serious demeanor. "So, I hope you've had the time to give me a more detailed explanation of what brought you here." "Yes. I'm here because my friend, a Shinigami who came to the world of the living to retrieve a dangerous weapon from a group of half-hollow criminals, saving my life in the process, was arrested due to the machination of somebody in Soul Society who is after the weapon. She can't defend herself without risking to reveal where she put the weapon, so I've come here to play distraction while some friends sneak in and either act as witnesses of her innocence or break her out." Tatsuki let out a long breath, happy that she'd managed to convey everything she'd needed to without letting out too much about anything, then asked with a grin. "Is that good enough for you?" "Maybe. You say that these half-hollow people you met are criminals, but aren't you one as well? How does that works?" Tatsuki could admit to some surprise at the comment. "You saw me in my transformed state." When Kyokaku simply nodded at that, Tatsuki's confusion grew as she asked. "And you helped me anyway?" "It's because of that I decided to help you in the first place, actually." "Really? I thought you people here in Soul Society all hated hollows." "Normally, you'd be right, but you said yourself, you're not a hollow, you're half-hollow. And that matters." Kyokaku leaned forward, a spark of interest in her eyes, almost eager, as she asked. "That really depends on whether you know a man named Hirako Shinji, or not." Tatsuki felt a sense of unease in her stomach at that, and took a moment to consider how best to phrase her answer. Kyokaku seemed willing to wait patiently for it, until eventually Tatsuki felt confident enough to explain. "He's, sorta the reason I'm like this, really. I was dying, and he turned me into an half-hollow to save my life." Kyokaku seemed intrigued at that. "Oh? So he isn't one of these criminals your friend fought against?" Tatsuki let out a long breath, and admitted, continuing to feel very worried. "He's their leader." "Interesting. And yet, you're working against him, or at least, trying to save somebody who worked against him, calling this person a friend. A bit strange, isn't it?" Tatsuki, starting to get annoyed at all the questions, decided to go to the heart of the matter, slamming both of her fists against the table. "What's it to you? Why are you so interested in Hirako Shinji anyway?" Expression hardening on her face, Kyokaku pointed at her severed arm. "Because I wouldn't be missing this, if not for him." "Oh." Tatsuki was left stumped, unsure what to answer. Before she could think of something, Kyokaku's brother came back carrying a tray with 2 large cups and a kettle, which he placed on the table with a scathing comment at his sister about not being her servant, which generated some more shouted bickering before the man departed again. Tatsuki let the antics pass her by, paying no real attention to them, As she tried to figure out what she could do, her hostess served her the tea, letting her drink it while she collected her thoughts, but they kept going in circle, so in the end all she could was lower the cup and say, "I don't get it. If Hirako is the reason you lost an arm, why would you help a half-hollow like him?" That caused a hint of surprise to pass over Kyokaku's features. It was over quickly, but Tatsuki noticed. "You didn't know he was one too?" The woman shook her head. "No, although perhaps I should have expected it." "Okay. I'm completely lost." Kyokaku nodded. "That's fair, it's pretty complicated, but I'll try to explain." She took a sip of her own tea, then placed it down and began. "You probably have no idea, but here in Seoul society, the people who live in Rokanga are considered second-class citizens. This is especially true for the Shinigami, but any soul that formed in the Suryodai is likely to think itself superior to the rest of us just by virtue of being born in privilege." Kyokaku shrugged. "It gets worse the further away from the walls, but most of us don't really give it too much weight. It isn't nice, but it could be much worse, and at least they keep us safe from the hollows, so there's that." Her expression hardened, with the grip she had on her teacup doing the same. "But a few decades ago, things started to get worse. Sometimes, people started getting eaten by hollows in areas that should have been safe, because the Shinigami didn't show up in time. People started to be murdered without the culprits being found, and eventually, some souls started to just disappear into thin air, no remains, to killings, no trace left at all of what happened to them. It started to create discontent, and since I've seen what happens to us little people when we start to complain to the Godai too loudly, I took matter in my own hands and went to try and talk with the captain of the 3rd Division at the time, since it's supposed to be their duty to keep us safe. Said captain was, of course, Hirako Shinji." She let out a long breath, then went on. "As it turned out, he was more open to listen to me than I hoped for. Maybe it's because I had my brother, who was training in the Shinigami Academy at that time, accompany me, but whatever the case, Hirako didn't laugh or send me away. He believed what I told him. However, he was concerned when he found out that no record existed of the disappearances, and he became convinced that somebody within his division had been falsifying reports, so he started investigating in secret on his own, with just my help." Kyoko lowered her head, and said, sounding sadly, "That's when everything went wrong. He contacted me to let me know that he had found some new clues that might lead to the real culprit, and gave me an appointment, but when I went, I didn't met him. Instead, I was attacked by what looked like a kid that had turned into an hollow, and got hit by a Zero that disintegrated my arm. I barely survived, and once a lot more hollows appeared at once and things started exploding, a lot of others didn't." The woman seemed to compose herself, draining her teacup of its contents at once, then slammed it down and said, sounding angry, "And then, a story started to make the rounds about the med captain of the 3rd Division having turned some of his subordinates into hollow in some med bid for power, but he had been stopped and exiled from Seoul society with his pet monsters along. No mention made of his investigation, or the reason why he would have done this, as clear a cover-up as I've ever seen, but of course, who would believe me if I explained the truth?" Tatsuki frowned, then said, "That's not how the story was told to me." "So, you're saying that Hirako was never guilty?" Kyokaku snorted. "I wasn't sure at first, but once Jin Ichimaru was named his successor, things started to make sense. Ichimaru is from the Rokanga, but he was never one to shrug and accept the situation we lived in. From what few information I could collect about him, some people seemed to think that some of the never-solved murders I told you about earlier were his doing. But the truth of that is impossible to prove now, because once he got power, he used the excuse of solving the problem of growing crimes with extremely harsh measures. He personally led raids that exterminated large groups of what he classified as dangerous criminals. And most were, but not all. He also targeted people who couldn't possibly be involved in it, but which, I realized, were some of those who'd been helping me and Hirako with our investigation, or many who had known him before he became a Shinigami." Tatsuki's eyes widened at that. That didn't sounded like a peacekeeping operation at all. He was taking loose ends and cleaning after his own tracks, wasn't he? Kyokaku looked grim. "That's what I think, yes. Luckily most people weren't aware I was still alive, so I laid low, or else I fear I might have been targeted as well." When Jin was done with his cleansing, It is true that a lot of districts were crime-free, and a lot more of the Rukonga was what the Suriati would call respectable, she scoffed, to show how little trust she put in such a definition, but the worst of the worst were pushed out to just a few of the outlying districts, forcing the poorest of the people there to put up with them, and many of the poorer areas were completely abandoned, like the one where you were fighting into. The sound of her nails scraping on her cup caused her to glance at it, letting it go with a grimace before continuing. Basically, Jin made himself look good while making sure nobody would be able to find any proof that his rise to power was built on the blood of innocent people. Tatsuki had known, from Yoriyuki's tale, that Jin was a despicable individual, but having it told to her in such a direct manner let her trembling with rage. So, he let you without any way of taking him down? That sucks. What do you take me for? Tatsuki blinked, refocusing her attention on Kyokaku to see that there was a furious fire in her eyes that matched what Tatsuki knew she herself was feeling, and then the woman continued, her anger palpable in her every word. Of course I didn't just give up on getting justice. But, I knew I had to take a different approach, so I had my brother make a career for himself in the Shinigami Corps, becoming well liked and well known as he gained ranks and status in the 13th Division. She sounded wistful as she added, seeming to be speaking to herself for a moment. Kyan always had a talent for that. Then she shook her head and continued, her tone turning sadder. But just a couple of years ago, while I was finishing putting together all the evidence I've been collecting about Jin throughout the years, so he could present it to his own captain and try to use his power against them, my brother died, as did his wife, killed by an hollow in what was considered a tragic accident. But I don't believe it. I think Jin got wind of what Kyan was planning somehow, and got rid of him in the same way he'd been using hollow attacks to cover his actions many years ago. Tatsuki frowned, then asked. If he knew that, wouldn't he have gotten rid of you, as well? Kyokaku shook her head. I was careful to only meet Kyan very rarely, and never directly. Besides, as soon as I heard what had happened, I relocated here with my little brother, covering our tracks so that we wouldn't be found out, just in case. She let out a long breath, then went on, her tone raising from dejected to hopeful as she spoke. Honestly, I had no idea what to do next, but when I heard that a group of half-hollows were in Rukonga, I immediately remembered what they'd said about Hirako having some with him when he managed to escape, and so I tracked down the closest place I could find where fighting was going on, and found you. Tatsuki nodded. Okay, I guess that makes sense of why you wouldn't be afraid of me, but, why tell me all of this? Kyoko raised an eyebrow at that. Didn't you just said to me that your friends are trying to get an audience with the court your other friends is being judged by, that they have a plan to help prove her innocence? Yes, that was the idea. Well, what if they also handed over all the proof I collected about Jin's guilt? Do you think that would help in getting your friend to be pardoned? Tatsuki's eyes widened at that, even as a shark-like grin formed on Kyokaku's lips as she said. It's a good idea, isn't it? Tatsuki had to agree that it was, but the problem with it was quick to present itself to her head. That'd be awesome, but I don't know that I can get it to them. My friend used a hole in the security to teleport directly inside the wall, while we're well outside, with all the Shinigami and Jin himself in the way. How would we get it to them? Kyokaku seemed to think it over, then answered, in a more serious tone. I might just have an idea that might work, but it's very dangerous. That caused Tatsuki to grin. If I was scared of trying dangerous stuff to save a friend, I wouldn't be here in the first place. Her determination seemed to impress Kyokaku, for the woman laughed and slapped her own leg with satisfaction. All right then. Do you need any rest? Tatsuki thought it over, then answered. Maybe? I could keep going if we need it, but using the power of my hollow can cause headaches, so if you could let me have a brief nap, it would help. Kyokaku seemed to consider this, then nodded and said. That's fine, the preparations for sneaking you in will take some time anyway. Then she paused, and pointed a finger at Tatsuki as she added, her tone suddenly threatening. Screw this up and I'm gonna make you regret it. Are we clear? Don't worry, I won't. My friend needs the help, and I can wait to put this Jin bastard in his place. Kyokaku seemed happy with that and left, while Tatsuki moved to lay down on the nearby cot and rest her head for an hour or two with a big grin on her face. It seemed that things were looking up after all. I knew it. I knew doing you this favor was a bad idea, Izuru. Chad looked up at the form of the 4th Division medic who had healed both him and Izuru Kira. The small man looked like he was about to have a panic attack. Hanataro Yamato was short, barely past 1.5 meters in height, and his chin-length black hairs looked like thin wet noodle, which combined with small irises and larger than average eyes and a scrawny build contributed to give him a very nervous look. And he seemed to react with fear to anything that happened to him, although in this particular case, Chad could see how he had perhaps valid reason to be nervous. Izuru seemed to disagree, as he said, sounding very reasonable. I think you're making a bigger deal of this than it is, Hanataro. Am I? You said I just to heal you and this guy, but first it turns out he's one of the invaders, and now there's 2 more who are also invaders, and one is half and hollow. He pointed to where an unconscious Ichigo, with his hollow mask on his face, was standing on the cot, Chad's friend having been dragged in by Yoriuki, who had shown up in her cat form and was still in it. While it was hard to say on her cat face, Chad thought she was genuinely amused. She was at the very least letting that impression be the most easily perceived surface emotion on her soul, at least, and as it was, she spoke, her voice a deep male one, with a certain hint of urgency to it. Since we're here, you might as well get on with it, right? The sooner you finish helping us, the sooner we can be out of your hairs. Hanataro looked at Yoriuki and answered, fear clear in his tone. That'd still be helping enemies of the Godei. Can't you imagine what Captain Anohana would do if she found out I'd done something like that? All 3 Shinigami in the room, Yoriuki included, seemed to shiver at the idea. Chad wondered why this would be particularly scary when they'd been opposing Soul Society already, but before he could ask, Izuru seemed to collect himself and ask, in a serious tone. Does that mean you're not going to help, and let him die? He gestured to Ichigo's form, and after a brief moment, Hanataro's shoulder sagged. You know that I can't let somebody this hurt go without help, I'll do it. That caused Yoriuki to nod. Good. We just need to figure out why his wounds aren't healing. Normally, small puncture wounds like this should be easy for him to recover from, but for some reason his hollow healing doesn't seem to be working properly. Hanataro looked quite surprised by that. Really? He can regenerate, but it's not working? That's very weird, let me take a look. He moved to where Ichigo was laying, waving his hands over him in weird patterns and calling out a set of spells, all starting with Kaido and followed by the names of what sounded like scanning devices. The first created a set of magnifying lens that seemed anchored to Ichigo's body, the second made the various wounds he'd received glow with golden light from within, the third formed a complex web of interlocking lines of light over his body, the next formed a fluctuating bubble all around his body, and the last one seemed to cover his body with a long set of half a meter long glowing golden needles. With each new spell, the expression on Hantaro's face grew ever more confused and worried, but he said nothing, using his wings to move the needles or lenses around, often tracing the lines of light to make their configuration change or poking the bubble to slightly change its shape, clearly trying to divine something about the wounds and how to cure them but explaining none of it. Eventually, he stopped in his examination, letting out a long breath, and said, "This is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen." "What do you mean?" "I mean that, while he looks wounded, and he's certainly losing blood at a rate that would have already killed him if the hollow he's apparently drawing Ryotsu from hadn't been constantly replacing it the whole time, the body isn't actually wounded, itself." Yoriuki's cat eyes narrowed, even as she jabbed with her tail at the many open cuts Ichigo had in various points of his body. "Those look very much like wounds to me." Hanataro scratched his head. "They might look it to a simple look, because we know that a body isn't supposed to have those holes, but that's not what they feel like to the body itself. It's not easy to explain." Yoriuki tapped her tail in annoyance on the cot's armrest she was sitting on. "Try." "Well, you know how tissue is just a collection of fibers, tiny threads of muscle material, and when it's cut, these threads are left dangling. Well, in his case, they're not. Instead, the cut threads are connected together, as if they were always meant to be that way. The edges of the severed blood vessel are attached to each other, like a continuum, and the skin is scabbed over as if it had knitted itself together with the neighboring tissue, and it was a scrape rather than a cut that it had been damaged by." Chad could see he wasn't the only one who was left a bit perplexed by the explanation. Yoriuki was the first to voice her confusion. "So, the wound was made with some kind of self-repairing ability, but one that stops further healing. Hanataro shook his head. Not exactly, it's more that the hollow's regeneration converts the Ryotsu the hollow provide into connective tissue wherever it detects damage to be present. But, since these wounds don't have any damage the Ryotsu can perceive, there's nothing for it to repair and replace. And that's not all. In addition to this, the portions of the wounds that are damaged are also covered in a film of steel that is attached to the external tissue, as if, once the body had healed itself, somebody had managed to weld a protective cover over it without causing it any more damage. Because of this, if the repaired vessels were damaged by jostling the boy, the steel would keep the wound from reopening, and on the other hand, if the body had some sort of regeneration that could grow new tissue from existing cells, the steel would act as a barrier and prevent that from happening. He frowned, clearly very unhappy with the whole situation, and concluded. I have no idea how any of this was achieved, but whoever did really wanted this boy to die. It seems like the strike was directly aimed to stop most any type of healing ability at once. That caused Chad to lean forward, as a sudden worry seized him. So you can't heal it? Hanataro blinked at that, then grimaced and answered. I should be able to, but I'm not sure how much that'll help. Why wouldn't it? Because of the contamination. Hanataro let out a long breath, then pointed at the mask and went on. I've never seen somebody who was bound to an hollow like this before, so I might be wrong, but it doesn't look good at all. The hollow regeneration transforms the hollow's gaseous Ryotsu into one whatever other type of Ryotsu the body is missing, such as blood, and works the same. And I can see, from other places where he'd been wounded before, that once it's not being actively converted, the normal Ryotsu slowly replaces the hollow Ryotsu as a component piece, in points. Chad frowned and asked, not seeing what the point was. That would suggest he would recover in time. Hanataro wrung his hands at that. Maybe, but I'm not so sure. See, his soul is, well, a patchwork would be my best definition. It seems like it's been broken into a million different pieces, and while whomever managed to suture it back together did a pretty amazing job, which I'm not sure I'd be able to replicate, it still left cracks in there. And the hollow Ryotsu has infected the cracks and papered over it, but rather than the normal Ryotsu taking it over, fully healing the cracks over time, in a few of areas, the hollow Ryotsu took it over instead, and spread over and into the normal one. There's other places where there is similar hints of contamination, which I think are places that were wounded and healed by the hollow's recovery powers multiple times. And of course, even as I explain this, more and more of his blood is being replaced with blood that has a hollow origin. The longer this goes on, the closest his soul gets to being hollowed out. Chad frowned at that and asked then, letting his worry show in his voice. Then shouldn't you hurry up to heal him as soon as feasible? But see, that's the thing. I'm not sure how to go about it, other than simply rip open the wounds again, hope they remain open, and let the hollow regeneration take care of the healing, which would exacerbate the problem. Could you not use your sword for it? Hanataro's sword, as Chad had been able to verify for himself, had the very weird power of removing wounds from people it struck. A gentle tap with it had been enough to cure both him and Izuru of everything they'd received during their fights. However, the Shinigami shook his head at that, and answered. It doesn't work that way. My Shikai takes stock of the body, finds places where it is damaged, and removes the damage. But if I used it on him, it would find nothing that is damaged, because the wounds were made to be integrated with the rest of the body so that nothing is amiss. Izuru huffed at that, motioning at the mix of red blood and dark smoke that poured out of the wounds. How can that be fine? He's bleeding. Yes, but that does mean anything. Bodies are full of holes that have a reason to be there and secrete substances. That's how sweating works. The only way to realize the hole shouldn't be there is the lack of continuity with the rest of the body, and that's what they don't have. Chad was not prone to showing anger, especially against something that was no the fault of any of the people in the room, but he could still feel his fists clenching in annoyance. So, even your sword cannot help here. He opened his mouth to answer, then paused, and said, thoughtful. Actually, it just might if only in making it so I don't have to actually operate on the modified tissue, and only need to remove it, it also make it very faster. The Shinigami drew his sword and whispered, fulfill, Hisagomaru. The sword glowed red for a moment before settling in its Shikai. It didn't look very different from its sealed form, sporting the same katana blade, blue handle, and circular crossguard. The only change was that, across the hilt, what looked like several glass gauges could be seen, not unlike a thermometer would have, several of which seemed full with a mercury-like liquid, except it was red. Hanataro looked at Ichigo's body with a careful eye, pointing his blade at it, and then a very thin beam, barely the width of a needle, erupted from the blade, making one of the wounds glow red for a moment. As soon as it stopped, Hanataro's lip curved into a hesitant smile, as he whispered, "It seems to be working." Yuriuki leaned forward then, peeking curiously at Hanataro's work. "What, exactly, is working?" "One moment." A second beam erupted from Hanataro's sword, hitting Ichigo, and making all of his wounds glow with the red light, before the Shinigami let out a breath, as if relaxing, and turned toward Yuriuki to explain what he'd just done. "My Shikai doesn't simply removes wounds from a target, it also stores them for future use." He pointed to the gauges on the hilt for emphasis. "I can shot beams at targets that are carrying one of the injuries I put away, and if the beam hits, the target immediately receives that wound, regardless of any defense they might have." He then gestured at Ichigo. "I looked for very minor wounds that would work to remove just the weirdly modified portions of his body, reopening the wounds without any invasive surgery and much quickly than otherwise possible, to let his hollow regeneration take over without interruption. I was worried that the effect that had been applied might have forced the regeneration to go back to the modified state, but that doesn't seem to have happened, so he should start recovering now." And indeed, keeping watch on Ichigo showed the wounds, clearly delineated by the mix of red and golden light, quickly closing as the hollow regeneration got to work. While that happened, Chad let out a breath of relief, and with Ichigo's health no longer in danger, found himself with a question for Hanataro. "When you said your sword was not well suited to combat, I thought it to be because your only power was to heal with it. If you can deliver collected wounds at range, surely that is powerful enough." The man shook his head in a depressed fashion. "Not really. I can only collect the wounds of people who survived being wounded like that, so I can't capture kill strikes or anything. Plus, head wounds are both rare and very lethal, and anything else is completely pointless, since hollows regenerate from anything done to their body. And that's without considering how a lot of hollows have different anatomies from normal. Plus, it's not much use to sever a hollow's hand when they have a dozen tentacles or 3 pairs of wings to use instead. Really, my power isn't much good for combat, healing is what it's for." Hanataro seemed quite depressed at this, despite the fact that, in Chad's opinion, his read of the situation was quite superficial. After all, wounding an hollow could slow it down enough to enable a strike at the mask, and against humanoid opponents, the sword could have some use. Before he could say much of this, however, Izuru just shook his head in an exasperated manner. "You never stop beating on yourself, Hanataro, do you? I just say things as they are. I'm no good at fighting, I'm just a medic." "Right. Anyway, shouldn't Ichigo be awakening now? He's not bleeding and there's no light coming from the wounds anymore." Chad turned to look at Ichigo at that, confirming the truth of Izuru's words. Hanataro did the same, frowning as he moved to poke the bubble and move around the golden needles, suddenly looking quite preoccupied as his movements grew more erratic and his eyes widened, sweat forming on his brow as he continued to work. Seeing as he didn't explain what the reason for his sudden tense attitude was, Yuriuki poked him in the side with her tail, causing the young man to turn to her with a sudden, surprised nervousness. "So? What's the issue?" "Ah, it seems like the hollow's Ryutsu is refusing to be reabsorbed into the mask. It's like something is trying to drag it back, but the current keeps switching the direction it's moving into. I don't know how to fix that, I've never seen anything like this before." "Break the mask." Hanataro turned toward Chad at his comment, and he explained, trying to sound patient to keep the nervous man from panicking any further despite the worry he was feeling for his friend. "The mask forms the connection to the hollow. If it is broken, the hollow is automatically reset. Hanataro nodded, hurriedly moving several of his golden needles to hover above the mask before pushing them downward with a few quick movements. As he did, the mask broke apart in 4 fragments, except that, instead of disappearing, the piece stayed there, before the cracks started to glow red and, evidently, trying to reassemble themselves again. Hanataro panicked, a note of hysteria entering his voice. "It's not working, it's not working. Try again, quickly, but this time don't just break it, pull the pieces away. Spurned on by Uruaki's commanding tone, the medic obeyed, cracking the mask once more and quickly ripping away the broken pieces. However, when he made it to the largest one, the one with the red stripes that was still covering the left half of Ichigo's face, he seemed unable to separate it. He immediately moved his golden needles to concentrate on it, trying to break it in smaller pieces that'd be easier to remove, but they didn't seem to penetrate, and he had to settle for placing a cordon of them all along the edge of the mask piece, before taking a step back and cleaning the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his kimono and then turning to the group. I think the hollow is trying to gain control. It seems to have gained a foothold of a sort, or something like that. Your friend is fighting it, but I don't know if he'll be able to win. I did what I could, sealed the mask so it couldn't grow any further, but that'll only hold if your friend can keep fighting. If he gives in, then I don't know that I can stop this. What I've done should at least give him a chance, but if he can win or not is up to him. Every member of the group turned to watch Ichigo at that, and Chad spoke to the group with a confidence he wasn't feeling as he promised. Don't worry, Ichigo won't let himself be worn down. What Chad didn't tell the rest, however, was how worried he was over what such a victory might cost. Chapter 47, Questions. When he arrived at the 3rd Division's headquarters and containment area, Toshiro was hoping to find his captain there with at least one of the other invaders prisoner. And while he did found both his captain and the person he had imprisoned, it was not at all in the way he had expected, as Captain Swyfon, Captain Tuan, and even Lieutenant Sasakaibe. This surprised Toshiro enough he didn't know what to do. Captain Ichimaru, on the other hand, was more than ready to speak, grinning even more than usual. Toshiro. It seems you captured the mastermind, didn't you? Captain Swyfon scoffed at that. More like the second-string servant. It's clear now that his actions were just a big distraction. Toshiro had no idea what the captain meant by that, but Urahara clearly did, as he said, sounding very amused. Now that's a little harsh to a former colleague, don't you think, Swyfon? Especially coming from you, of all people. Toshiro could see the anger on the captain's face, and how she was gearing up for some retort that was sure to devolve in an argument. Thus, to keep Urahara from creating more problems, Toshiro removed his sword from the levitating block of ice he'd enclosed his legs into and was using to move around, and smacked the back of Urahara's head with the flat of the blade, creating a nice gag around the man's mouth while trying to hide his own embarrassment at the prisoner making a scene. Before he could apologize, however, Lieutenant Sasakaibe spoke up, in an appreciative tone. Even if you are correct, Captain, it is still impressive that Lieutenant Hitsugaya was capable of triumphing over the rebel. Then the man turned to him and added, honest concern clear in both his face and voice. Although it seems clear that it was a hard-fought victory, Lieutenant. You should head to the 4th Division, to see that your wounds are taken care of. Toshiro hesitated at that. While Sasakaibe was only a lieutenant, he was the 1st Division's lieutenant. Everybody knew he had refused to be made into a captain multiple times, and that he was just as strong as Captain Yukatake and Kiraku. To disregard an order from him, even one phrased as a polite suggestion, was incredibly disrespectful, and that was when he wasn't speaking on behalf of the captain commander himself. However, as Toshiro's eyes passed over the people in the cells, an unconscious Momo, an unconscious and battered Renji, and a Rukia that was wrapped in Lieutenant Omada's chain and trapped in some kind of trance, he felt conflicted, as he really wanted to ask why all of his friends were caged, and why Rukia had been transferred here from the 2nd Division's cells where she had been before. Unsure how to convey his question without being disrespectful, his gaze moved to his own captain. Luckily, Captain Ichimaru immediately understood what he meant, as his smirk took a more understanding quality. Learning to gauge the meaning of the captain's smiles was something Toshiro had worked very hard at, since the man didn't seem to ever sport any other expression, and he said, in his usual amused tone. Maybe we could explain to Toshiro what's going on here? After all, he has a personal connection with all of our prisoners here. He's surely experiencing some distress at seeing them imprisoned without knowing the reason for it. Lieutenant Sasakaibe seemed surprised by this, while Captain Swyfon's eyes narrowed in sudden suspicion. You have no idea about why your friends would be under arrest, Lieutenant. Toshiro was surprised by the suddenly aggressive tone, but shook his head, answering. I know that Rukia is currently under process. Did something else happen? Lieutenant Sasakaibe took over in answering, his tone polite and clearly aiming to be reassuring. It seems that the attack on the Rukonga was a distraction so that the traitor Yoriyuki Shihoin could infiltrate the 2nd Division's holding area in an attempt to free Miss Kukaki. She made use of 2nd Seed Hinamori to infiltrate the prison, and we have received a report from Captain Kuratsuka that confirms Miss Hinamori was previously seen in the company of 2 different invaders, who have since confronted Captain and Lieutenant Kuratsuka and managed to escape their grasp. Toshiro couldn't believe this, and spoke without thinking. Normally he wouldn't have, but the fact that Momo, of all people, could be accused of cooperating with people like Urahara who turned people into monsters made no sense at all to him. But surely there must be a reasonable explanation? Maybe one of the invaders has some form of mind control power, or something like that. Luckily for Toshiro, Lieutenant Sasakaibe didn't seem bothered by his words, even as he explained, in a patient tone. While that is certainly a possibility to consider, I'm sure you can understand why we cannot take risks, Lieutenant Hichugaya. These events paint a picture that makes Miss Hinamori seem complicit with the invaders' actions, and until we have verified that this is not true, it would be irresponsible to let her move freely. Toshiro lowered his head in a show of respectful acceptance, so that his frown would be hidden from the sight of his superiors. All this didn't sit well with him at all. He already wasn't happy with Rukia being under process, but he had been sure the Godi I-46 would recognize her as innocent and Captain Tissan's accusation nothing more than a misunderstanding. Instead, the action of the invaders were now making Rukia look much more guilty, while also seeming to suggest that Momo had been her accomplice. None of it made sense to Toshiro at all. Indeed, considering how Captain Aizen had been murdered. Toshiro's eyes moved toward Captain Ichimaru almost on their own, before he suddenly stopped himself, internally cursing Urahara for having planted such unbecoming suspicions in his mind. Looking for something else to distract him from the line of thought he was bound to otherwise go down, he raised his head again and quickly asked. And what of Renji? What has he done that deserved being arrested for? Instead of Lieutenant Sasakaibe, it was Captain Tuan to answer the question, in a very annoyed tone. Lieutenant Abarai interfered with the capture of one of the invaders, taking arms against myself in the process. That. Toshiro couldn't believe that would be possible. Renji attacked a captain. You must forgive Kaname here, Toshiro, he's just taking our defeat a bit harder than he should. While Captain Tuan couldn't glare, he turned toward Captain Ichimaru with a suddenness that made it seem as if he'd been ready to attack him, before stopping himself. Of course, Captain Ichimaru didn't react at all to this, other than his smile growing a bit sharper as he continued. What he meant to say is that one of the invaders had surrendered to Renji, who had received orders from Captain Kukaki to bring him that invader alive. When we showed up, the invader revealed he had been only pretending to surrender, likely to have the chance for a surprise strike at a captain. I think Renji only wanted to ensure the invader was captured alive, as he was ordered to. I'm sure once Captain Kukaki shows up to discuss the matter, finding a solution will be easy. Toshiro wasn't sure what to say to that, but Captain Tuan clearly did, as he said in a very annoyed tone. That's a lot of assumptions you are making, Captain Ichimaru. I think this whole thing is extremely suspicious, especially now that we know the reason of this attack was for Rukia Kukaki to be freed by the renegade Shihoin. In fact, is it not even more suspicious that it was her who showed up? I believe Captain Kukaki was one of his disciples at one time. He might have kept contact with the woman and sought her help to unlawfully break his sister out of prison, couldn't he? Captain Swafon looked incensed at such a comment as she spoke back, a flicker of fury showing through in her otherwise carefully controlled emotions, even as she did her best to keep her tone cold and firm. Captain Kukaki is no more an ally of the traitor than I am. That you would dare say so insults one of Seoul Society's 46 great clans. Captain Tuan turned in her direction, and his tone was harsh. Does it? You say he's no more allied with her than you are, but weren't you her disciple as well? And you let her slip through your finger, which is how she was able to rescue the invader we had cornered, and would have otherwise captured. Was that really just incompetence on your part, or was it intentional? Captain Swafon's hand closed around the hilt of her Zanpakuto, the knuckles white with the strength of her grip as she almost snarled. How dare you? Lieutenant Sasaki raised his hand as he took a step forward, moving in between the two captain, and despite his official rank being inferior to both of theirs, the action was enough to stop them both, as he said in a conciliatory manner. There is no need for this to create strife within our ranks. We know very little of the invaders' motivations, and until we learn more, speaking such words to each other is only going to weaken the united front we should try to present to our enemies. That gave Toshiro an inspiration, and even as the two captains backed down from confronting each other, Toshiro spoke up. Lieutenant Sasaki, I actually carried out a small interrogation of my captive, and he revealed that the goal of their faction in coming to Seoul Society was to find and bring to justice whomever murdered Captain Aizen. Captain Tuan crossed his arms at that, and commented. Are we to believe the words of traitors now? Captain Swaifon glared at her dark-skinned colleague, then turned her attention to Toshiro and said. He told you this himself. Yes, Captain. And while Captain Tuan might be right, that he was just lying, it didn't seem so to me. Toshiro held the woman's gaze as he said so, hoping that she could see his honesty. He had no idea what was going on, but he was sure that, whatever was going on, Captain Aizen's death had to have something to do with it. While Captain Tuan looked clearly unconvinced, Lieutenant Sasaki and Captain Swaifon seemed thoughtful, and when Toshiro looked at Captain Ichimaru, he saw the man's smirk of amusement transition to a smirk of satisfaction, as he clapped his hands, gathering everybody's attention as he said. I think what Toshiro says has merit. After all, Aizen stated he had information that could prove Rukia's innocence, and was about to testify about it, before he was killed. In that optic, it certainly would seem like freeing Rukia Kukaki is the ultimate goal of this invasion, whether Captain Tuan's supposition over who is ultimately behind it are correct or not. Captain Swaifon looked annoyed at that, but Lieutenant Sasaki seemed more receptive as he asked. I have the impression you bring this up for some particular reason, Captain Ichimaru. That's correct, Lieutenant. I think we should split the prisoners up, and while I keep the rest of them here in the 3rd Division's containment area, move Rukia to be contained within the Central Palace. Toshiro was surprised by that suggestion, and he was not the only one. Captain Swaifon and Captain Tuan both looked quite surprised. Lieutenant Sasaki himself looked thoughtful, and eventually answered. This is a valid suggestion, especially since I only left my post watching over the palace when it became clear the 2nd Division's barracks were under attack and the Captain Commander decided we were to reinforce them. I was supposed to be back there already, but leaving the prisoner without a solid protection was too big a risk. Going with this idea would make it easier to ensure the girl is under constant watch. We might need to rearrange the disposition of our forces within the palace, but it might be doable. Captain Ichimaru grinned happily at that, then went on. I had precisely the same thought. In addition, it means that we will be forcing our enemies to divide their attention, since we'll be holding Urahara and Rukia in different locations, and then there's tactical advantage that, should my planned trap fail, we will at least not lose everything at once. Toshiro was surprised at that comment, even as Lieutenant Sasaki and the two other captains nodded in clear agreement with Captain Ichimaru's suggestion, and asked, perplexed. What trap? Captain Ichimaru grinned in the manner that Toshiro recognized as self-satisfaction, and answered. This little thing I'm setting up that, if it works, will allow us to capture all the invaders in one fell swoop. But I'll explain you everything about it later. Right now, you really should go to the 4th Division to see that your wounds are treated. Toshiro nodded, and moved to leave, although not alone. Lieutenant Sasaki, Captain Swaifon, and Captain Tuan all did as well, with the about 24 soldiers of the 2nd and 1st Division they had brought with them following alone, Omada transporting Rukia, who was still captured in the trance caused by the 2nd Division Lieutenants Shikai. Toshiro had to admit that it was an impressive show of force for the transport of a single prisoner, 2 captains, 3 lieutenants, one of which was Sasaki, and nearly 30 rank-and-file Shinigami, a dozen of which from the 1st Division, was a big enough force to give pause to nearly any kind of opposition. Yet, he couldn't help but feel conflicted about being part of it. The group was transporting one of his closest friends to a place from which escaping would be pretty much impossible, and while he knew that, as a Shinigami, it was not his duty to judge, merely to accept the judgment passed down from the Central 46, he didn't feel very confident. After all, Captain Aizen's death was obviously connected to all of this, and after hearing the venom with which Urahara had sworn vengeance over his dead captain, Toshiro firmly believed the man had been honest about it. While Captain Ichimaru and the rest hadn't seemed to grasp at why that was important, merely considering it a proof of the invaders' tactical goal, to Toshiro, the important thing was the way it made him feel that something was amiss. Why would Rukia ever willingly work with people like the fire girl who had nearly crippled him, or a madman like Urahara? Why would the invaders, made up of half-hollows and traitor to Soul Society, care about a Shinigami? Why would Captain Kukaki want the invaders, or at least one of them, captured alive so strongly that Renji would fight a captain to ensure it? Or was Renji lying, and working with the invaders? Was Momo? The latter was the thing that ate at Toshiro the most. He knew his friend, and she wouldn't ever take action against Soul Society or the Godei. Toshiro was sure of it. There had to be more to all of this. He was so caught up in his own thoughts, trying and failing to find an explanation for what was going on, that he left the group and headed for the 4th Division almost on autopilot, only surfaced by it when he felt a very powerful yet impossibly placid soul suddenly appear in his awareness. He raised his head just in time for Captain Anohana and her lieutenant, Isane Katetsu, to enter the room where he'd been made to wait. As usual, Captain Anohana's presence was both calming and scary. Everybody knew she was the only survivor of the original 13 captains that had founded the Godei 13, and she was rumored to be on par with the captain commander, or possibly even stronger, yet she looked much younger than Captain Yamamoto, more like a motherly figure than the man's wise grandfatherly look. In addition, her riot suit, which enveloped everybody in her presence, always had a feeling of calm imposed over it, layered so thick and strong that merely being in her presence automatically relaxed one's soul. Which, of course, was incredibly scary when one considered how this slight sense of drowsiness could easily slow down the reactions of patients in the event she took umbrage to something one of them said, leaving them very much in her power. It was the sort of experience that Toshiro would have difficulty describing to somebody who hadn't experienced it. Regardless, the calming effect helped Toshiro relax his turbulent thoughts, even as the captain of the healing corps smiled at him and asked, in her matronly tone, "You seem troubled, young man. Is it because of the fight that caused you these wounds?" He shook his head. "No, Captain, I won the fight and captured one of the invaders, the traitor Kisuke Urahara." She nodded amiably at that. "A victory then. Yet your soul is clearly far from shining with satisfaction. Instead, you seem to have many doubts. Why is that?" "It's this whole invasion situation, and the murder of Captain Aizen, and it's all so complicated. I just don't know what to think of it, I guess." Captain Anohana smiled friendly at that, before she made an absent-minded gesture with her hand, and a set of glowing golden orbs appeared around Toshiro, each one orbiting a part of his body while flashing with green, blue, or red light as they did. It seemed like some form of analysis-focused Kido, although certainly not one he knew how to cast, but Toshiro didn't really pay it too much attention, much more focused on trying to settle his thoughts. The captain obviously saw this, as she suggested, in a soft tone. "Maybe you need to talk about what you don't understand with somebody." I'm not sure how much that'll help, honestly. I'm more that I am full of questions that needs answers, rather than facing a puzzle that I need help solving." As soon as they were finished, the golden orbs slowly flew towards Captain Anohana in a line, each dissolving as it hit her forehead, and once they all had, she nodded to herself, before saying, in a more serious tone, "For the extent of your wounds, a normal treatment by means of medical Kaido would require about a week to properly carry out. However, considering the situation of emergency, and the fact that none of your wounds damaged your internal organs, it might be better to let Isane treat you. Would you consent to that?" Toshiro looked up to his fellow white-haired lieutenant, and nodded. He had been treated by her before, and knew that her Shikai was an ice elemental one that allowed her to transform anything, be it item or person, in whole or in part, into a perfect replica of itself, but made of ice that she could sculpt and manipulate freely. This meant that, thanks to her medical knowledge, she could stab a part of somebody's body that was mangled or otherwise wounded, and simply set it straight by reshaping it into a fully healed condition, before transforming it back into its original form. So long as the wound wasn't to an organ that would cause the patient to die if it was transformed to ice, the power was one of the best Toshiro knew of in terms of healing abilities. Having received his authorization to proceed, Lieutenant Katetsu nodded at Toshiro before drawing her sword and whispering her release phrase of, "Run, Ida Gumo," causing 2 additional prongs to sprout from the snowflake-shaped crossguard before she moved closer and gestured for Toshiro to lie down on the bed, gently laying the blade over both his leg to turn them both to ice and get to work. While Lieutenant Katetsu was at work, Captain Anohana moved closer to the bed, a kind smile on her face, and said, continuing their previous discussion. "If what you seek is answers, rather than help, then perhaps the right thing to do would be going to the person who has these answers. Waiting to confront a problem will never make it go away, it will just grow and become a bigger challenge to defeat it. Unless that is what you are looking for, proactive and decisive action is always the correct answer to every problem you face." Toshiro considered the captain's words, and couldn't help but admit to himself that there was some wisdom to them. He would solve nothing by merely racking his brain over what was going on. He needed to actually go and look for the answers he needed, and wanted. But, of course, that had an obvious problem. "I don't think that all of the answers I'm looking for are known to the same person. In fact, I think I'd need to ask a lot of questions to a lot of different people." Captain Anohana hummed, apparently thinking the matter over, before asking, gently. "I think what you need to learn, young man, is to prioritize properly. Is there, perhaps, one question that you would like answered more than any other?" Toshiro thought it over, and for a moment, he couldn't find anything that stood out, but just as he opened his mouth to say just that, suddenly one question emerged above all others, the one that had left him most stumped and confused of them all. How was Momo involved in all of this? Momo was probably Toshiro's oldest and greatest friend. While they weren't sibling, they'd been brought up together by Toshiro's grandmother, and thus considered each other as if they actually were brother and sister. While she had made many other friends, and tried to introduce him to them all, he still knew her best than he knew anyone else, and, he was sure, better than anybody else knew her, as well. They shared in the dream of becoming Shinigami to make life better for those living in the Rokanga, where they had both grown up, Toshiro by protecting them with his sword, and Momo by creating new things meant to make their life easier. She would never throw that dream away, which going against the Godai would be. She wasn't one to have such flaky beliefs. No, Toshiro was sure that something was up with Momo, and he needed to know what, and the only person that could tell him was Momo herself. Having found his resolve, he looked up to Captain Anohana to give his answer, but the woman smiled and spoke first. "You have found one, haven't you?" "Yes." He nodded, his fist clenching in determination. He would get to the bottom of this all, no matter what. Chapter 48, Prisons. Rukia blinked, feeling as if her mind had just left a warm cloud of cotton wool. She felt a strange sense of loss and cold, as if she'd been within a warm embrace and had just now left it. She tried to remember what had happened, but all that she could recall was a few flashes, a sudden image of her brother praising her, of laughing with Kyan, of her sister hugging her, and a sense of loss, at having just lost something she knew she could never have. Her eyes filled with tears without her even realizing it, and the weakness at the sense of loss that invested her was such that she didn't even realize as her muscles gave up on her and she collapsed to her knees. "Man, no matter how many times I see it happens, that creeps me up every time. You and me both, man, you and me both." "Oh, shut up, both of you, my Shikai isn't creepy, it's impressive." "Impressive, you hear me?" "As you say, Lieutenant." "Sure thing, boss." "Good, and don't you forget it." "Oh ho, that's excellent work, but you can leave the prisoner to our care now." Rukia hadn't been really paying attention to the bickering between the members of the 2nd Division. The last thing she remembered before the hole in her memories was that Captain Swaifo had wanted her lieutenant to immobilize her with his mind Shikai, so it wasn't surprising they'd be around now. However, she recognized the new voice, and it wasn't from any member of the 2nd Division. It was completely out of place, almost her guardians. In fact, she was so surprised to hear it, that she managed to fight her way past the dizziness and weakness that had hit her to turn around and check. What she found was proof that her ears had not deceived her. To speak had been a large, broad man with a bald head sporting black, bushy eyebrow over red eyes, and a huge, toothy, and happy smile poking from a long black beard that reached to the top of his chest. Around his neck was the most eye-catching article of clothing he had on, a set of red prayer beads so large that each individual bead was the size of Rukia's clenched fist, but underneath that, the kimono he was wearing was unmistakably marked with the symbol of the 1st Division. Just as she'd thought, yet would not have expected, it was Ichibe Yusub, the first seat of the 1st Division, who was talking with Lieutenant Omada and the rest of his 2nd Division's flunkies, and she had no idea why a member of the Royal Guards would be assigned to take care of a Shinigami accused of nothing more than acting out of jurisdiction. It made no sense. The man, oblivious to Rukia's sentiment, clapped his hands together in a happy gesture before motioning for the group of Omnitsukido Shinigami to leave. Omada, who despite being big was not as big as Ichibe, seemed to be mustering his courage, until eventually he said, hesitant. "Ah, first seat Yusub, considering who is after the prisoner, Captain Swafon asked me to be at hand to provide help, just so that." "Nonsense, my boy, nonsense." The man patted Omada on the back in a friendly manner, making the lieutenant stumble even as he interrupted him, and then went on, in a relaxed, happy tone. "The 1st Division shall need no assistance in securing a simple prisoner. If necessary, we will move some of the guards watching over the throne room here, enough so to ensure that no escape is possible. To let something like that happen, why, it would be an insult to the 1st Division's honor. Why, even the mere idea would be." Omada was left unsure what to say, to which Ichibe reacted by placing a friendly arm around his shoulder as he said, in a comforting manner, "And of course, I know a good boy like you would never insult the honor of the 1st Division, right?" Omada paled at that and answered hurriedly, "Oh, of course not, first seat Yusub, sir. Nothing was further from my mind." Ichibe nodded enthusiastically, patting the man on the shoulder in a comforting manner. "Just as I thought. I knew you were a good boy. No need to waste any more of your time here then, young boys like you need to go and experience all that the world has to offer." He let go, and Omada left at such a quick walk it felt very much like he was running away, his subordinates following him at a similar pace. Ichibe put his fists on his waist as he watched them go, chuckling to himself, before turning back toward Rukia, the brilliant smile still on his face. "So, what shall we be doing with you, little Miss Kukaki? You've become quite the headache, you know." Rukia did not, in fact, know, and so she steeled herself, slowly getting to her feet before eventually asking, looking the towering man straight in the eyes. "I was not aware that jurisdiction encroachment was a crime worth the attention of the Royal Guards." "Oh-ho. Is that what you think you are here for? I should then inform you, little Miss Kukaki, that you are mistaken. In addition to jurisdiction encroachment, you have also been accused of partaking in subversive activity, conspiracy with enemy of Soul Society, abetting treason, and of course, complicity in the murder of a captain of the Godii 13. The sudden set of accuses were a shock to Rukia, but it was the last which felt like a punch to the gut, her eyes widening and her breath hitching for a moment before she whispered, in disbelief. You think that I helped those who murdered Captain Aizen?" The man patted his large belly, as if to keep himself from laughing at her surprise. "Why wouldn't we? The man was killed just before he could testify, mighty convenient, isn't it?" At that, fury filled Rukia, as she took a step forward and shouted. "He was going to speak in my defense. He'd have proven that I'm innocent, and only did what was required to ensure the safety of everybody in both Soul Society and the mortal realm." "Oh-ho. Was he?" The man leaned forward slightly, and even that bit was enough to make him loom over her, despite the bars between them, as he went on. "Of course you would say that, makes it look like the victim of a setup, doesn't it? But on the other hand, if he was going to speak against you, and confirm your guilt, silencing him is all to your favor, isn't it? So you can play the innocent victim." "I'm not playing at anything." "Aren't you? When you hid what you know from the Honorable Central 46. Rukia grit her teeth. They didn't know who could be a spy for Jin, and she didn't have all the information the captain had. It had been the plan that he would speak on her behalf, both because the accusation was so wild that it coming from a captain would make it easier to believe, and because he had the ability to collect and present evidence that Rukia simply didn't have. Still, at this point, she could see that the plan had completely failed, so she let out a long breath, trying to control herself, and said, in as cold and emotionless a tone as she could manage through the fury she was currently feeling, Then bring me to the Central 46 and I'll tell them all that I know. It was a last resort, but while they weren't certain that none of the Central had been compromised, it was a better gamble to take than risk telling it to any one random Shinigami who could be one of Jin's plants. However, she wasn't even done saying it that Ichibe shook his head and said, in a patronizing tone, "I am afraid that is not how it works, little Miss Cookaki. The Central 46 decide who they want to speak with, and when, and what about. You don't get to make any requests. And I am most certainly not bringing a potential traitor in the middle of our ruling body just because they request it." At that, Rukia's anger flared again. She'd have punched the bars of her cell, but she knew that'd be less than pointless. She could sense the shock Kido they were imbued with, and the only result she'd get from doing so would be to hurt herself. Still, she shouted back, "Then go and ask them. Tell them I want to confess all that I know, and see if they want to hear it." "Oh ho, I don't think so. The central chamber has been sealed by order of the 46, and none can enter it, not even the captain commander himself, until this situation is resolved and there are no more risks of an attack. We shall only be receiving orders from within, but nobody will be allowed inside. The safety of our government is far more important than the crying and complaints of a traitor." "I'm not a traitor." "That's not for you to decide, but for whatever judgment is cast once your process is concluded." Rukia was ready to keep arguing, but then, suddenly, a huge and powerful pressure, so thick with disdain it was almost literally like a steel vice closing around her neck, flooded her room and the corridor itself. It was only a mix of her great control and the extreme familiarity with it that allowed her to withstand it when it impacted her with such strength. She was quick to get herself back under control, however, and the riot so thinned, not by much but just enough that resisting it was trivial, instead of an effort. While Rukia herself had needed a moment, the big man on the other side of the cell had remained completely unaffected by it, instead turning toward the opposite end of the corridor and the figure that was, unhurriedly and with absolute poise, walking down it. Ichibe maintained his friendly smile as he greeted the newcomer by opening his hands in a gesture of welcome, as would be used among equals, rather than a respectful nod or bow. "Lord Cookaki. What a surprise, I was not informed you were to come." The expression on the face of Rukia's brother remained as impassive as it usually was, much like the Ryotsu he was projecting across the room was tinged with the shade of disdain that he generally defaulted to when interacting with Shinigami he considered as social inferiors, not any mark of annoyance. Despite this, Rukia was pretty sure that Byakuya wasn't happy at all. While the emotional aspect of the Ryotsu he was leaving out did not suggest this, the quantity he had released did. Even when angered, he generally kept such display under a fourth of his maximum, while not he was leaving out far more than that, almost one-third, in fact. Despite this, his answer was delivered in the commanding but otherwise emotionless tone he favored. According to the laws of Soul Society, any captain of the Godai 13 or head of one of the 46 noble clans of Soul Society is allowed to check on prisoners accused of treason at any moment and without warning. Consequently, I need neither authorization nor to send a warning to be here. Ichibe let out a deep belly laugh at that, to which Byakuya didn't react in any way, and then answered. "You are taking advantage of a law meant to ensure that no accomplices of a traitor can organize a jailbreak by making it impossible for schedules to exist that can be planned against? That is a very interesting choice in this particular situation, especially coming from you, Lord Cookaki. Our laws are what keeps Soul Society safe. Respecting, following and protecting them is no more than what it is expected of a Shinigami of our standing." Ichibe's expression didn't change, nor did he show any hint of a change in his expression. Even his feeling, from what Rukia could feel, never wavered from the jovial cordiality that he had kept all throughout the meeting and which, in fact, Rukia had not known the man to ever drop. Yet despite all this, despite the jolly and joking tone he spoke with, there was no doubt in her mind that her brother's lack of reaction to his words had angered him. Naturally. I would expect nothing less of the head of the oldest of the 46 clans. I merely was surprised, as marching in while letting one's Ryotsu run wild is not what I would have expected from such an esteemed and noble individual. I would have expected greater control from one such as you, Lord Cookaki." As usual, Byakuya maintained the same expression, but he let his Ryotsu explode outwards. Rukia realized it was about to happen from the way he let it flicker just a moment, something nobody else would have caught on but which she knew was his signal for her to brace herself. She did, holding her breath for the brief moment that Byakuya let his Ryotsu show in full, while giving his disdain a note of disbelief, one that could be read as polite, but Rukia knew was here meant as dismissive and an insult, just not one that could be acted upon, or even openly acknowledged, by the receiving part. Ichibe didn't react in any way, which was impressive in itself, even if it only lasted a fraction of a moment. Rukia knew that even some captains would be bowled over by direct exposure to her brother's full Ryotsu if they didn't counter it with their own. Byakuya didn't seem surprised, indeed, he looked completely impassive throughout, before he said, in a serious tone. My control is absolutely perfect. But I am sure you did not mean to suggest otherwise, Lord Usopp. Ichibe moved to play with the beads around his neck with one hand, as if considering this, before answering, still sounding polite but a bit less joyful than before. I have to admit, such split-second control is impressive. It does raise the question of why you would manifest so much Ryotsu in a supervised area that contains a dangerous traitor, Lord Kukaki. Some might consider that a threat, a demonstration of power meant to intimidate the First Division. Such would be very insulting to the First Division's honor, after all. Byakuya's gaze seemed to gain some extra intensity after that, while giving a slight twist to his Ryotsu so that the disbelief disappeared from the emotions he was letting others perceive, replaced by haughtiness. Some might consider saying that a captain of the Gotei 13 and head of one of the 46 noble families had threatened any Shinigami, much less an entire division, to be an insult as well. And noble houses are honor-bound to deliver appropriate retribution for such insults. Indeed. There was a long beat of silence after that, with Byakuya's intense gaze and Ichibe's jolly smile facing each other, the latter's emotion still unfailingly jovial while haughtiness slowly eclipsed disdain in Byakuya's perceivable feelings. Rukia was unsure what would happen here, not that she could do much even had she wanted to get between the two of them, but the tension was not something she was prepared for. Eventually, despite nothing changing, either outwardly in their faces and postures or internally in what could be perceived of their emotions, Ichibe let out a long, bellowing laugh. Of course, nobody here had any intention to insult anybody. Isn't that right, Lord Kukaki? Naturally. Now, if you would, Lord Usopp, I'd ask you to leave so I can talk with the prisoner privately, and thus be able to discharge my duties as swiftly as feasible. Ichibe crossed his arms at that, using one hand to stroke his beard as he did, looking and sounding thoughtful even as he continued to maintain his previous friendly demeanor. Would it not be preferable for me to stay? After all, the bond between master and pupil is very deep, and some people might consider a private meeting suspicious. Having somebody present would guarantee that none would be able to shame the reputation of the Kukaki family. While I appreciate the concern, the Kukaki family has no reason to fear shame, so such is unwarranted. Ichibe seemed to consider this, before his expression grew a bit more serious, the smile disappearing for a moment. You are making a mistake, boy. I taught your grandfather, and his father and grandfather as well. You are superior to them all in skill, and I would have loved to help sharpen those to their deadly extreme. The Kukaki were among the most respected families, the ones more proud to defend our values. He leaned forward slightly, pointing a finger at Byakuya, and went on. But then your father decided to ally with the Shihoin, one of the families most lacking in wisdom, unwilling to show a proper dedication to our traditions, and made you the apprentice of a woman that went on to bring untold shame on their name. The taint of being such a woman's disciple is not easy to shake, and your actions here do you no favor in achieving it. Is it not yet too late for you to correct the course the Kukaki family is walking? I could help you with that, if you would just see sense. As if to mark the point, Ichibe offered his hand for Byakuya to shake. Rukia's brother looked down at it, then back up into the man's eyes, and said, no inflection in his tone and nothing but boredom in his emotions. The Kukaki family had no need of assistance to correct the course it is on, nor indeed any reason to change said course at all. All that it requires of you, Lord Usopp, is to show proper courtesy and polite behavior by granting the simple request that has been made of you, and leave. The big man slowly took his hand away, shaking his head, before he returned to his jovial smile. Oh-ho! I shall leave you to your business then, Lord Kukaki. And with that, the giant of a man left, and Byakuya slowly turned to focus his attention on Rukia directly. She assumed a more composed pose, or as much of one as she could in her cell, while making sure the only emotion she was keeping on the surface of her soul was polite interest. She didn't say anything openly, and she could feel her brother's feeling tinged with the slightest hint of approval as he said, in a serious tone. I am here because we need to discuss what has been happening recently, and how involved you are with it. Were you told much about why the charges against you were changed? Rukia shook her head, adding a hint of confusion to her feelings, which caused Byakuya to display some annoyance in his own, even as neither his expression nor his voice wavered. A group of invaders appeared in the Rokanga, including several visored, and led by Urahara Kisuk. It turned out they were a distraction for a different group, which included a Quincy, to try and infiltrate this very palace, and the group's overall leader, Yoryuki Shihoan, attempted to free you from the 2nd Division containment facilities, and failed only due to interference from Captain Swafon. Rukia's breath hitched at that, and she had to work hard to conceal all of her shock and surprise at that, but from the way her brother raised an eyebrow and laced his feeling with the slightest hint of disbelief, she could tell that she'd failed to hide her reaction from him. He didn't let out any other sign of being otherwise annoyed, instead asking, the slightest sense of demand in his feeling but none in his voice. Even if you had no expectations this would happen, I expect you can guess the reason why it did. Rukia nodded at that, letting a bit of the sense of defeat she was feeling be perceived by her brother. While she had no idea whether there were listening spells imbued in the walls here like there'd been in the 2nd Division's cells, she doubted the area was completely devoid of any. Trying to focus on a suitable compromise, she answered. Captain Eisen had evidence to deliver to the Central 46 that would have proved the innocence of more than just myself. I imagine freeing me was an attempt to recover that evidence. Byakuya let the slightest hint of bored curiosity peek among his feelings, and Rukia quickly added, letting a bit of desperation surface for Byakuya to sense. I don't actually have the evidence, but if I could speak with the Central 46, I might be able to solve this entire situation. Brother, couldn't you get me an audience? That is not possible, the Central 46 cannot be disturbed with petitions when they are in closed session. You were already aware of this. There was now a sense of unyielding determination to what Rukia was perceiving from her brother, and she was left with no idea as to what she should do. Before she had time to come up with some sort of response, he went on, deadly serious. Your friend Momo Hinamori was also arrested, suspected of cooperating with Yoryuki Shihoan in her infiltration of the 2nd Division Containment Center. Her friend, Toshiro Hitsugaya, captured Kisuke Urahara and faced off against a girl that could turn into an hollow with fire powers, although she evaded him. Renji faced off against a orange-haired boy who had the ability to call upon a hollow mask with red stripes. He succeeded in capturing the boy alive, as I had ordered him to, but Shihoan intervened and freed him before Renji could bring him to me. And Captain Kuratsuke, who faced off against the Quincy boy, also reported about his daughter facing off a full-bringer with time manipulation abilities. Rukia knew what her brother was doing, and focused the best she could to not let any of her emotions through as he spoke. She could feel them wanting to slip through as she was overwhelmed, by gratitude that her friends had all come to save her, by worry at the danger they were putting themselves in, by gratitude for how far they were willing to go to help her, by hope at the possibility they might succeed, by dread as she considered that they might fail. Her brother, of course, had no reaction at all, making it impossible for Rukia to tell if she'd managed to keep her feelings secret from him or not, but after a brief moment, he went on, in a serious tone. While I cannot grant your request, it is interesting that you would make it in the first place. After all, you were given a chance to tell everything you knew to the Central 46, and did not. I imagine that was Eisen's decision, and you were but following his orders, but I have to wonder at the reason for such secrecy. I wonder if any of these invaders would know the reasons for it. Rukia felt a spark of sudden surprise escape her control at her brother figuring that out, and she knew he'd sensed it, because he nodded sharply the very moment she did, and commented. That is interesting. His emotions settled into quiet resignation, and he closed his eyes for a moment, before opening them again and looking straight into Rukia's. The invaders will not be able to get past the 1st Division guards here, especially with Yusub personally keeping watch over your cell. Whatever your sentence ends up being, I expect you to accept it with the grace expected of a Kukiki, and not to shame our family any further. Rukia was so shocked by this, she failed to keep the emotion under wrap, and Byakuya reacted immediately, disappointment quickly overtaking all other feelings in his soul and even a hint of harshness entering his voice when he asked. "Am I being clear, Rukia?" She gathered her bearings, letting a bit of her resignation filter through so that her brother could perceive it, and then nodded and answered, her tone as firm as his own. "I understand, brother." Byakuya seemed to accept this, curtly nodding once more before he turned and walked away. Rukia kept her emotions in check until he finally left, and only then allowed herself to lower her barriers, and feel the mix of pain and hope she was being wrecked by. She knew it was a bad idea, and that they had almost no chance of making it past the royal guards, and yet, Rukia desperately hoped, with all of her being, that her friends would be able to save her. Ichigo woke up laying on a hard, unyielding surface, everything around him dark. He frowned, then blinked a couple of times to help his eyes adapt to the lack of light, only to realize that something was over his eyes, keeping them covered. He tried to move his arms to reach whatever that was, only to find that he seemed to be surprisingly weak. He was clearly wrapped in something yielding but strongly secured to keep him in place, and his muscles seemed weaker than he remembered them being, as if drained of their strength. Still, with no other recourse available, Ichigo closed his eyes, and focused his spiritual sense, trying to use that one to understand what was going on. Unsurprisingly, he was still in spiritual form, and he was apparently wrapped into the equivalent of a blanket, although one made of some sort of extremely durable material, and which seemed somehow anchored to the ground upon which he was laying. There was also a presence nearby, only one, and somewhat familiar. It took Ichigo a moment to properly place it, and once he did, suddenly, a shiver went down his spine. And that was when his inner hollow started to laugh, a deep, throaty sound that was filled with dark amusement. "I hope the accommodations are to your liking. I didn't have much time to set them up, as it were." How? This made no sense to Ichigo. If, as it seemed likely, he was within his mindscape, then he shouldn't have appeared trapped like this, should he? Then again, the mindscape was a representation of the state his mind was in, and his Zanpakuto had said that it wouldn't easily change. So, he was probably in the basement that Shiro was trapped into, as some sort of representation of the hollow trying to take over Ichigo's soul. Meaning he had to get out it as soon as he could. "How did you manage to drag me into your prison?" "My prison? I would say that it is now your prison, don't you agree?" Ichigo ignored the barb, instead closing his eyes and focusing on his Ryutsu. He wrapped himself in a full armor with Hakuda, and while he didn't really have it in himself to give it the steel quality, disdain was a very difficult emotion for him to be able to feel at a whim. He focused his determination to get free as much as he could, something which come a lot easier. In fact, it was the only emotion he'd yet managed to complete a full body cover with. As it turned out, that sufficed, allowing him to rip himself out of the hardened cloth he'd been wrapped by, quickly getting on his feet even as he was able to regain his sight. What he found was the image of the big hollow, covered in black fur, the curved red horns atop his head, golden eyes glowering within its white mask with red stripes as usual, but it was lounging on what seemed like a huge black throne, something which Ichigo was pretty sure hadn't been there the last time he'd been there. One of his hands was resting negligently on an armrest, while the other was closed in a fist under the creature's chin, in a mockery of a thinking pose. The hollow didn't seem intimidated, surprised, or even annoyed that Ichigo had escaped the restraints, instead chuckling at the sight. "You think that meant anything? I was just messing with you a bit for fun. If I had wanted to trap you for real, no amount of effort on your part would have allowed you to escape me." Ichigo ignored the beast, turning his back on him and heading toward the ascending stairs that should lead outside. He could barely make up some light coming from the door at the top. However, before he had taken more than 2 steps, the black walls of the room suddenly seemed to turn fluid for a moment, before they flowed in front of him, completely covering the exit and then melting back into the walls. As the exit disappeared completely from his sight, Ichigo turned back toward the hollow, who let out another amused laugh when he saw the annoyance that Ichigo knew was etched on his face. "I told you, if I don't want you to leave, you won't." Then, the hollow waved the hand that wasn't supporting its chin, and every wall of the room, as well as the roof and floor, assumed a more fluid texture, even as the hollow leaned a bit forward, its golden eyes glowering with deadly intent. "In fact, I think it's well past time for you to pay your rent. You haven't given me any food in a long while, and personally, I'm starting to feel quite hungry." Ichigo barely had the time to roll to the side as a multitude of tentacles erupted from the walls, and then had to jump a moment later as more rose from the ground, trying to envelop him. He used the Fullbringer's airwalk almost on instinct, making the air elastic for him to bounce off of, and was glad that it worked, but even so, more and more tentacles appeared from all around him, their number growing without any apparent limit. Not so easy to defend yourself from me when you don't have those cursed Zanpakuto doing the work for you, is it? Just like any other Shinigami, without your sword, you are worth nothing. Ichigo grit his teeth as barely managed to dodge the last batch of attacking tentacles, the glancing blows resulting from it rattling him to the bones, or at least, the sole equivalent of that. A thought which, suddenly, made him realize that he wasn't as unarmed as Shiro thought him to be. On the next attack, instead of trying to dodge, he half-turned, letting himself be smacked around, as he focused his full attention on something other than dodging. The obvious result was that a handful of tentacles managed to catch up to him, wrapping around his legs and waist, but before they had the time to do more than get a grip, he swung, severing the tentacles. Of course, with them no longer holding him, he fell, but he focused underneath himself, forming a Reishi platform to land upon, before straightening himself, the Reishi sword he'd formed glowing and vibrating in his hand as he glared back toward Shiro. The Hollow's eyes glowered more at that, and Ichigo couldn't deny a certain satisfaction at the annoyance in his opponent's voice. Quincy are perhaps the only thing I hate more than Shinigami, you have no idea how annoying it is that you happen to be both. Not that it'll save you. Once again, the Hollow gestured, and a thick wave of black liquid rose from the floor and charged at him very fast. Ichigo knew he couldn't simply cut apart, and felt annoyed at how he couldn't use his usual trick of wrapping the blade in Hakuta-charged Ryotsu as he normally would have, before frowning, as he realized that, in fact, there was no reason the ability should be limited to only Zanpakuto. It took him a couple of heartbeats more than usual to do it, as the Reishi sword was almost naturally trying to absorb the Ryotsu he was trying to cover it with, but an effort of will was enough for Ichigo to keep up the shroud over it for the one moment he needed to charge it with repulsion just as he swung. The impact of the attack made the wave of darkness explode, and in the moment of surprise that caused to Shiro, Ichigo dashed forward, using repulsive Hakuta for the initial accelerated push and Fullbringer airwalk to keep himself accelerating forward. Despite Ichigo's quick movement, the Hollow managed to roll out of the throne, and as Ichigo slammed into it, the structure exploded around him into a thick, viscous cloud that then immediately solidified into a multitude of tentacles already wrapped around Ichigo's limbs. Their grip closed so strongly and firmly that he had no time to slash them open, and in a brief moment, he was immobilized completely by it. He tried to struggle free, but the tentacles just constricted themselves more thickly, keeping him trapped, while Shiro slowly got up from the ground, using one hand to mockingly clean himself of dirt, while strangely keeping the other one firmly closed into a fist, and slowly moved forward, until he could grab Ichigo's chin within his fingers and place their foreheads against each other, the glow from his eyes so strong as such a close distance that Ichigo could feel his eyes starting to itch almost immediately, while the Hollow's grip made it impossible for him to look away. Such a pathetic effort. Are you ready to surrender now? Ichigo ignored the comment, instead trying to collect his Ryotsu to break free again. Before he could, however, the tentacles suddenly glowed red, and Ichigo felt his whole soul being racked by incredible pain, completely destroying his concentration and leaving him reeling and panting. The Hollow created a pair of new tentacles to specifically force Ichigo's eyes open, and then growled in a threatening tone. I'm going to make you suffer a whole lot if you don't stop being stupid. Surrender, now. It was a tiny thing, and if Ichigo had not shared his body with the Hollow for so long, he might have missed it, but instead, he managed to notice the barest hint of urgency and frustration almost escaping from the Hollow's soul. Which made very little sense. The Hollow had him dead to right, and had already said he wanted to eat him. Why not do that and kill him? Why was it so determined in wanting Ichigo to submit to him? Only one answer was forthcoming, and much as Ichigo thought it was no more than wishful thinking on his part, he had no other option left, and so he said, letting his belief and determination show through as he did so. Never. Shiro took a step back, almost as if Ichigo had slapped him, and Ichigo grinned as he continued. You can't kill me, isn't it? Something, somehow, is stopping you. As long as I resist, you cannot just take over. After all, if you could have, why not do it before I woke up? You're powerless to hurt me, that is why. Shiro grit his teeth at that, his eyes glowing menacingly, but now that he was paying attention, Ichigo didn't miss the clear frustration taking over as the most prominent emotion the Hollow was feeling. Still, the monster didn't seem cowed, and if anything his words had a dark, venomous quality to them. You think yourself so very smart, don't you? But let me tell you, you've miscalculated. I cannot kill, eat, or take over you without your consent, but I can hurt you. And I will. I will hurt you so badly, and for so long, that at the end, you will beg me to take over, to put an end to your pain. Ichigo didn't doubt that the Hollow would carry out his threat, but he didn't let himself be scared. Instead, he capitalized on the fact that his words had caused Shiro to let go of him, and wrapped his sword in a sheath of fury. Of course, the tentacles wrapped around his hand made sure the blade was pointed upwards and away from them, and that he couldn't move his fingers at all, nor let the sword go, but it did nothing against the fact that the blade was something Ichigo was sustaining and shaping with the focus of his mind. Thus, it was the matter of a breath to reduce the sword to only its blade, dissolving everything under the hilt, and with no longer anything to keep it up, the sword fell straight into the tentacles wrapped around the arm, cutting them as well as setting them on fire. The moment the flames reached the tentacles around his arm, Ichigo wrapped that same arm with determination, which in this case was better than disdain as it took longer to heat up, thus giving Ichigo the chance to swing the new Quincy sword he'd created for himself through the tentacles he was setting on fire, and to walk through the resulting fire and free himself, without getting hurt. He noticed Shiro clenching his fist in anger as Ichigo walked out of the flames, and then he waved his other hand, the fire being immediately smothered by dark smoke that erupted from the floor and ceiling both. It also worked to conceal Shiro's position, but Ichigo did not have a problem getting past that, instead merely closing his eyes and using his spiritual sensing to find his enemy before charging at him. As he did, he noticed that the tentacles seemed made from Shiro's own Ryutsu. A moment of further focus proved to him that the wall was, in fact, covered with it, and that Shiro was simply pretending to have the power to reshape Ichigo's mindscape at will, but in truth only manipulating his own Ryutsu to an extent Ichigo had never known the Hollow to be capable of before. However, Ichigo realized, this also meant every tentacle was, in practice, a part of Shiro's body, in a sense. Which was why the Hollow was still reeling from Ichigo's escape from the tentacles, because the entire room was, in effect, Shiro's body. The Hollow managed to recover fast enough to dodge Ichigo's slash, but when he did, Ichigo didn't pursue, instead standing where he was, even as he turned in the direction his opponent was moving toward just to make it clear to Shiro that he knew where the Hollow was. As he'd expected, the gesture caused the Hollow to stop and ask, in a mocking tone that made it clear he had recovered his confidence. Not even trying to hit me anymore? Have you realized the pointlessness of it and are you ready to give up? Ichigo smiled confidently as he shook his head, and answered. I realized the pointlessness of it, because I have already won. Ichigo wrapped the blade he was carrying in a coat of anger and stabbed it into the ground, and in the moment Shiro reeled back from it, he let go completely of his soul, instead focusing his Quincy powers to create a multitude of needles all over the room. He could feel the tentacles starting to wrap around him even as the needles started to fall to the ground, but before they could, he used Hakuta to create the thinnest coat he could, starting from his finger and wrapped around each needle like a wire, and then charged it with excitement, letting go of it immediately afterwards and knowing they'd strike the ground the moment after that. The entire room lighted up as the 100 of electrical charges discharged at once, burning the tentacles holding Ichigo as well as causing Shiro to scream and fall to the ground in pain. Ichigo didn't hesitate, using his full bringer powers on the air to bounce himself directly on the Hollow's position even as he left go of all control of his body to create a Quincy sword in his hand as fast as possible, and then gaining control again just in time to swing it down, slicing Shiro's hand at the wrist. Before the Hollow could react, Ichigo immediately grabbed the severed and still closed fist and pried it open, revealing a orb of roiling darkness inside, just as he'd expected. He raised the item, holding it in front of himself as he glared at the defeated Hollow, which was glaring right back, its hand slowly regenerating by drawing in Ryutsu from the floor. I should have expected that you would find a way to take advantage of the fact I had something like this hidden into my soul. Should I use it to force you into compliance now? Shiro scoffed at that, and answered. Why am I unsurprised you would once again seek to use the power of one of us hollows to prop yourself up? Ichigo couldn't help the annoyance at the hollow's assumption. I'd only use it to seal you away. And what would that matter? You'd still be using the power of one hollow to cage another. I don't see why you're splitting hairs. Ichigo frowned at that. What do you mean? Shiro let out a bark of laughter as he slowly got up to his feet. Immediately, Ichigo aimed his Quincy sword at him, but the hollow merely rose his hands in a gesture of surrender as he said, I mean that the thing in your hand isn't hollow, one with the power of absorbing the Ryotsu of other hollows, and then controlling and manipulating any Ryotsu matching those that it has absorbed. A hollow who was engineered to have that power, and then cut apart and destroyed until it was shaped in a small portable form that could be used as a weapon. That's the only thing you Shinigami are capable of. That, it made no sense. Ichigo shook his head, rejecting the idea. You're lying. Shiro merely shrugged at that. Think what you will, I know that I'm saying the truth, because I saw it happen. What? How is that possible? When did that happen? The hollow grinned, and said in a threatening tone. Surrender to me, and I'll tell you everything. Do you think me an idiot? I think you brave. Admitting that would remove your defense, but I would still need to defeat you before I can take over, and now you're holding the Hujioku, surely that's a risk worth taking, in exchange for some answers? I promise you, you'll regret not knowing what I do. For a moment, Ichigo was truly tempted to give in, and maybe, if it had been only him that he was risking, he might have accepted. But it took only a moment for him to remember why he was even facing Shiro in the first place, and while he might be willing to gamble with his own life, he wasn't about to gamble with those of any of his friends, one of which he still had to save. Thus, instead of answering, he focused on the item in his hand. It was easy to feel the Ryotsu inside, and it was staggering how it seemed to contain an impossible, ever-changing variety of it, almost like the Minos Grande had had. Finding a specific feeling Ryotsu might have been impossible if he didn't have the sample to compare with right in front of himself, but with Shiro in front of himself, it took him just a moment to identify his signature. From there, it took only a thought for the entirety of the Ryotsu composing the room to immediately be reabsorbed into the hollow, revealing the stairs in the process, and then but a moment more to force Shiro's own Ryotsu in the shape of a cage wrapped in chain sealed around his body. Shiro scoffed, but now that the hollow was imprisoned, Ichigo raised the Hujioku and said, in a threatening tone. So, what's keeping me from simply use this to make you tell me all that you know? The hollow laughed. It doesn't work like that. You can control my Ryotsu, which means you can manipulate the way my body moves, even use it to trap myself, as you have, and obviously to draw on my power at will, if you so wish. But my will is not bound into my Ryotsu, you have no control over it. The only way you'll learn what I know is if I tell you. So, tell me, are you going to torture me for the information you want, boy? Ichigo did not answer, instead turning and leaving the hollow behind himself, ignoring the mocking laughter from the creature and the possibility that this was a mistake. Right now, he had a friend to save. Chapter 49, Allies. Uriah was always amazed by the efficiency of Orium's healing power. In the span of 20 minutes, he'd recovered from his fight with Kurotsuke, if not completely, at least well enough to be back in combat shape. Orium would have continued to heal him to full, but once Uriah was able to move around, their guide had insisted for her to dismiss her ability, on the basis that it was too attention-grabbing, and that now they were close enough to their destination, and far enough from the site of their battle with the Shinigami of the 12th Division, stealth should be privileged over swiftness. To help with said stealth, Uriah was now waiting in a garden, hidden behind a copse of trees with Orium, while the Shinigami, Tsukushima, had snuck into a house to get his hands on a katana that would help Uriah pass himself off as a Shinigami, since he'd lost the sword Urahara had given him. According to the man, this was the house of a friend who had a large collection of normal sword and wouldn't notice one missing. As they waited for their guide to be done, Uriah turned to Orium, who was more relaxed now, her fairies sealed back in her hairpins and her humming quietly to herself, running her hands on her Zanpakuto's hilt with a thoughtful and focused expression. Orium, now that he's not here, could you answer a couple of questions about this Tsukushima? She blinked for a moment, before refocusing on him and asking, confused. What do you mean? You said you'd spoken with him before and that he was a friend, but you never mentioned that. Was there a reason? Orium's brows furrowed. I guess it just never came up. We only met once and for a brief time, when he said he'd seen us fight the giant Hollow, but that he would keep it secret. Not even when we were planning a risky infiltration of Soul Society, and having an ally on the inside might have helped. I guess I didn't think of it. I wouldn't have known how to contact him anyway, I just knew his name. And yet, despite knowing so little about the man, you trust him enough you are willing to put our lives into his hands. Well, he kept the secret of our fight, didn't he? And, he saved me from Nimue, which means he saved us both from being captured. Why do that if he was our enemy? That was a solid enough argument, and yet, Uriah didn't find himself very willing to simply trust such a strike of luck. It was suspicious, and it required to believe a random Shinigami he'd never met before was well-intentioned. Still, he wasn't sure there was much point arguing the matter with Orium, not when he didn't really have a logical argument to present, so he answered, in a resigned tone. I suppose you have a point. I am just not the type to trust easily when we are in enemy territory. Orium patted him friendly over the shoulder, and said in a reassuring manner. That's fine, you're just following your guts. I am too, it's just that my guts and yours feel different. I don't know why, but I get this feeling that he's really trustworthy, like I've known him for a lifetime. Uriah decided to simply accept that, if it was down to feelings, perhaps Orium's were the best guide, since she did seem to have a sort of sixth sense for understanding people's attitude. Before he could consider the matter more, the dark-haired Shinigami showed back, handing off a katana to Uriah as he said, in a serious tone. To fully pass it off as a Zanpakuto, you need to place some serious amount of Ryutsu or Reishi over the blade, so that it seems to have a strong soul. Can you do that? In answer, Uriah used his Risotenge to wrap the entire blade in thin Reishi wire, before sheathing it again so that the thread would not be visible to an outside observer. After a moment, the Shinigami nodded in approval, his tone mild. That should work, so long as nobody focuses on it in particular. Remember that it's just a normal blade, not a Zanpakuto, it would not be much use in actual combat, and drawing it would give you away, so don't do that. That said, he took the lead once again, and the two of them followed. As they walked, however, Uriah took the opportunity to inquire over what the man was planning. While they might have no other choice than to trust the man, that did not mean Uriah had to stop being critical of him. So, where exactly are you leading us? To somebody I am certain will let you hide in their house, until this thing is resolved. That was suspiciously lacking in detail. How can you be so sure? Tsukushima let out a long sigh, as if annoyed at the questioning. Uriah, for his own part, was annoyed at the man's refusal to give him a straight answer and his apparent need to keep being as vague as possible. After a moment, however, the Shinigami asked, in a pointed tone. Even if I wasn't certain, can you really afford not to take the risk at this point? While Uriah had to admit to himself that this was a valid point, they didn't really know the area well enough to find a good hiding spot without help. He wasn't sure that warranted trusting somebody they knew next to nothing about. Before he could express his doubts, however, Orium interjected, in a hopeful tone. But you don't think things will go bad, do you? The man lightly shook his head. I don't. He offered a small smile, even if one with a hint of sadness and which disappeared quickly, and added. In fact, if we're lucky, once you explain your story, we might even get a new ally out of the deal. Uriah considered this for a moment before asking, careful. What do you mean with explaining our story? Well, I only know what I saw, which was you fighting a group of Vizard and then the Minos they summoned. If your story is believed, we might even gain help with your plan to free your friend Rukia. Orium seemed quite happy with that. Uriah was more skeptical, however, since it seemed too good to be true, too much of a lucky break. And how likely would you say that could be? Enough to attempt it, at least. But you don't need to take me on my word, we're arrived, so you'll be able to see for yourself. Tsukishima emphasized his point by nodding in the direction of a large white mansion sitting amidst a large garden. Uriah took notice of the fact that the houses in the area looked richer and bigger than they had been in the area where he fought Kurotsuki, many sporting tall walls or fences and similar large gardens that separated them from one another. It was pretty clear they had moved into a residential area reserved for the upper class of Seoul society, even within what had already been, by Uriah standard, a general sense of being within a rich neighborhood or suburb that he'd gotten from the other areas of the Suriati he'd seen. Something that Uriah noticed was that his senses also seemed to slid along the walls of the houses. That did not stop his range of perception, as such, but he could not sense anything inside. He glanced at Tsukishima with suspicion. Why is the house shielded from spiritual perception? The man raised an eyebrow, then gestured to the area around them and answered. They all are. We are in the noble quarters, even if only those of the lesser nobles, rather than any of the 46 families. Even so, people here highly value their private time, and the buildings were imbued with Kido that divert Ryotsu. It's actually quite practical, since in addition to hiding those inside from being spied upon, it also makes the buildings more resistant to damage. It makes it harder to check that this is not a trap. It also makes it so that, once you are allowed inside, nobody would be able to know. It's why this is the perfect place for you to hide it. Uriah decided not to push further, while Tsukishima himself looked thoughtful for a moment before stating. Come along, but let me introduce you and explain things before you speak yourself, that should make things easier for us. They did, and Tsukishima, taking point, led them to the door, proceeding to knock it. It took only a minute for the door to be opened by a man with unkempt stubble and long dark hairs that seemed tangled together, wearing a pink kimono with a white flower motif over his uniform, with the white haori of a captain over it all. Despite the man's disheveled look, Uriah saw a sharp glint pass through his eyes as he took them in, and even if it disappeared almost instantly, Uriah had no doubt the man had taken them all in and formed an accurate initial impression on them just with it. He might not look it, but this Shinigami was obviously extremely dangerous. And, it seemed, not the person that Tsukishima had been expecting to find here. As he almost took an instinctive step back, he didn't, managing to stop himself before he did, but being directly behind him, Uriah noticed the initiated and then abruptly interrupted movement. Still, their guide regained self-control very fast, and then said with a smile. Captain Kiraku, I didn't expect to meet you here, I'd come to speak with Captain Yukatake. Is he here? The man hummed, apparently in no hurry to answer, instead asking, as he scratched his head. You're Kenpaku's second, isn't it? Yes, Captain, Lieutenant Tsukishima of the 11th, that's me. If Kenpaku sent you here to bother Jushiro, I'll need to ask you to come back another time. He isn't feeling well right now, so whatever it is Kenpaku want from him, it'll need to wait. Tsukishima didn't seem fazed by this, if anything relaxing as he said. I see, you're here to take care of him then. Has his illness had one of its relapses? The man nodded lazily, even as he leaned on the doorway just a bit more, which caused him to loom slightly over the group. His attitude made it seem casual and in no way threatening, but with the way he'd watched them before, Uriah had little doubt the man was doing it on purpose. Seems so. I don't get much of it. Kido isn't my field, but Nanao is good enough at it to help, and it's a weight of my mind to make sure he's taken good care of. Which means he's not up to any work right now, so you can go back to Kenpaku and tell him he'll need to wait. If that was the reason for my presence, I certainly would, but I actually came here of my own initiative. I have learned some things on which I would like Captain Yukatake's advice, and I'm sure he, himself, would want to hear what I have to say. Kiraku frowned. That still seems like it's stress him unduly. Tsukishima didn't let that deter him, if anything letting his features take a more serious cast. I would ask of him nothing more than to listen, surely that cannot be tiring. And it is my firm belief that being denied the chance to learn these things as quickly as possible would cause him much more stress down the line. Surely, it should be Captain Yukatake's choice whether he wants to at least try and hear what I have to say. If he doesn't think it important, I will leave. You seem very certain that he'll want to hear it. What makes you so sure? Because it's about Rukia Kukaki. That caused Kiraku's eyes to widen in surprise for a moment. Once again, it was barely there and then quickly disappeared, but Uriah was keeping careful watch for the man's expression, so he didn't miss it. Then the man lowered his head, shaking it in defeat as he moved out of the door, gesturing for the three of them to enter. Wait here, I'll go tell Jushiro that you're here, and see if he wants to hear you. The defeat in his voice made it clear he already knew the answer and, just as Tsukushima had expected, it took but a moment for Kiraku to show up again and lead them to Yukate's sleeping rooms, although Uriah did notice that, while he was pretending to be distracted, one of the captain's hand was constantly hovering right next to the Zanpakuto at his belt, which, he realized, hadn't been there before. He'd armed himself in response to their arrival, and Uriah doubted that bode well. He also wasn't sure why the man had Zanpakuto along, but he kept the question to himself. If this whole thing didn't explode in their faces, maybe he would satisfy that curiosity later. The room turned up to contain 2 more people. The first was a woman with black hairs collected in a severe hairdo and oval glasses that would have made her look like a stern young schoolteacher, if not for the Shinigami uniform she was wearing and the Zanpakuto strapped across her back. The other was a thin man laying within a Western-style bed, with silver hairs so long they reached halfway down his back in a slim, perhaps even emaciated face. He clearly looked very weak, the only exception being his green eyes, which had a placid yet strong presence that Uriah thought was meant to be reassuring. If not for the fact the man was a Shinigami, Uriah might even have let himself be lulled into it. As they entered, said patient look was aimed at the teacher-looking girl, who was saying, in a doubtful tone, "Captain, I really don't think you should get into any conversation that might make you feel too strong emotions. These spells you had me cast on your behalf seem very sensitive to your emotional makeup, and I worry that getting into a troublesome conversation might damage the spells and cause them to unravel early." The man's smile was just as reassuring as his smile. "You worry too much, Miss Ise. I created some of those spells myself and supervised the first application of the rest. You are correct, the spells degrade based on which emotions I feel at the time, which is why it's impossible for me to precisely predict when I will need to renew some of them and can't foresee when I will be left in a bad condition by their failing. But I do know the rough duration, so you can trust they won't fail after just a few minutes." The woman didn't seem convinced, but nevertheless nodded and took a step back from the bed, while the silver-haired man turned to look at Tsukishima, Uriah, and Orium, a smile on his face. "Lieutenant Tsukishima, I must admit I am surprised to see you. Shunsui said you have something to tell me about Rukia." "I do, Captain Yukatake. I couldn't speak before, because it would have been just my word, and that would not have helped save the Lady Kukaki, but now I found somebody who can confirm it, and maybe even clarify how it came to be." Yukatake seemed perplexed, while Kiraku was looking at Uriah and Orium thoughtfully, clearly more interested in how the two of them could be able to confirm Tsukishima's story than in hearing that story itself. Tsukishima didn't seem to notice, however, as he went on. "I witnessed with my own eyes that Lady Kukaki, with the help of a number of humans, was fighting a group of Visored in the mortal realm, a group which was led by Shinji Hirako, and which summoned a Minos Grande that Lady Kukaki fought against alongside her allies." While Kiraku had no reaction to that, the girl, Ise, looked dumbstruck by this information, while Yukatake closed his eyes, letting out a long breath as he said, "So, that's what Aizen had her doing, hunting down the Visored." Tsukishima shrugged, before turning toward Uriah himself, as to encourage him to speak up. The Shinigami clearly wanted him to explain the situation, but after a moment of thought, Uriah turned to Orium instead and asked her, with a nod, "Orium, do you want to explain what went on to the captain here?" Orium seemed surprised at that, but then nodded with her usual bouncing energy, before turning toward the bedridden man and starting to talk. "Rukia showed up one day in our town, looking for this Hujioku marble that can be used to command hollows, and asked Ichigo to help her, both with fighting hollows and finding this thing. They asked Uriah to help them, and then Tatsuki, Chad, and I decided to join too. It turned out the marble was stolen by these half-hollow people who were allied with Ririka's friends, so we defeated them, and then fought the giant hollow twice, and in the end Rukia's plan let us steal the marble with a trick from their boss, Hirako. Then she was arrested, so we've come here to save her, because she saved everybody by getting the marble back, and to arrest her just because of a stupid rule that she couldn't be there is wrong." As she went on, more passion had entered Orium's voice. Uriah noticed that even Tsukishima seemed surprised by her vehemence, while Yukatake and Ise seemed genuinely shocked. But Uriah had kept his focus on Kiraku, and that had allowed him to notice when the man's eyes had widened at the explanation for a moment, and even looked emotional for a brief moment. While he was back to looking lazily amused by it all, Uriah was sure the man had believed Orium's honesty, as well as being affected by her emotional delivery. Still, Yucatec didn't take long to collect himself, although now there was clear respect in his eyes as he looked at Orium's focused expression and clenched fists at the idea of saving Rukia. You really care about Rukia, don't you? Of course. Rukia is my friend, and friends help each other. If Rukia hadn't given Ichigo his power, he couldn't have saved me and Sora, and I wouldn't have become a magical girl ghostbuster samurai. She saved everyone, to punish her for it is wrong and mean. While Yucatec seemed to take this in, Kiraku chuckled and commented, idly. That's some brave words, girl, but the captain commander would disagree. He'd say respecting laws is paramount, breaking them only leads to chaos. Orium turned to glare at him, which seemed to catch the man by surprise, giving her the time to reply, quite angry. Then your captain commander is dumb. If a law hurts people, then it's a stupid law, and laws are better than chaos only when they stop people from getting hurt. People are the thing that matters most, not chaos or laws or whatever. Kiraku, it seemed, had not expected Orium to be so ready to defend her position, and Ise looked quite scandalized at her words, although Tsukishima seemed quite satisfied at Orium's words. Yucatec, on the other hand, smiled lightly at it, and spoke in a benevolent tone. I can see you held strong beliefs, Miss Orium. Could you answer a few questions for me? Uriah's friend turned toward Yucatec, nodding happily, which the man took as permission to continue. So, you said that Rukia was trying to retrieve the stolen Hogyaka from the Vizard. Was this Rukia's own idea, or was she ordered to do this by somebody? Oh no, Mr. Aizen was giving the orders, but he couldn't come in the human world, or the spy would know. Spy? Yes, the spy in the 12th Division, the one who framed Mistress Yoriyuki and was passing information on Mr. Aizen's plans to the half-hollows. Yucatec looked taken aback by that, but Kiraku took over at that point, asking with interest. I thought Urahara was Hiriko's spy in the 12th Division, and that's why he left. No? I think Mr. Urahara left when Mr. Aizen asked him to, because they thought if he did that, the spy might make a mistake, isn't it? Uriah nodded when Orium turned in his direction to confirm that, he could understand her doubt, the whole situation was complicated enough, it was entirely possible she just wanted to make sure she hadn't missed any of the nuance. Kiraku seemed intrigued by that, and went on, his voice sounding a bit more involved than he had until then. So, you're saying that Urahara was not working with the Vizard? Orium shook her head decisively at that. Of course not, Mr. Urahara was right there with Mr. Aizen and Mistress Yoriyuki telling us what to do, that'd not make any sense if they weren't working together, would they? That's interesting, then why was Urahara seen in company of a Vizard with fire powers just this morning? Orium brightened at that, and explained happily. Oh, that's my friend Tatsuki. She was hurt in the battle with the huge hollow and Hiriko turned her in a Vizard, but she's still one of the good guys. She and him were making a distraction so we could make it to where Rukia is being processed, to testify in her favor and save her. Then Orium frowned and added, letting a bit of annoyance enter her tone. But then the Lady of the Trees was there and stopped us from getting in. That's so unfair. Kiraku seemed to have been left as speechless by that as Ise had been the entire time. Yucatec seemed to have collected himself, as he said, in a wondering tone. So, this is what Aizen had her doing. And Urahara, Shihoin, and you all were the people she said helped her find her balance. Leading a group of mortals in a mission to save the world, it makes sense. I can see how that would be just what Rukia would need. Kiraku turned a perplexed look on Yucatec, and asked. You believe them? Yucatec turned toward him, raising an eyebrow, and said in a disbelieving tone. Are you saying you don't? Kiraku seemed to have no answer to that, while Yucatec turned back toward them, still smiling in an understanding manner but with a certain fire in his eyes, a sense of purpose as he asked. I think it better that you give me all the details you have. Getting this through to the Central 46 is not going to be easy, since it's forbidden to disturb them in a sealed situation like they're into right now, and the Captain Commander would never favor going against their decrees, but maybe I can figure something out to save Rukia once I know everything. Uriah could admit himself surprised, while Orium whooped with joy at that. He did find the self-satisfaction on Tsukishima's face somewhat annoying, but decided to let it go, and was just preparing himself to fill in Yuka about the details, when, suddenly, the sound of rapid knocking suddenly interrupted his thoughts. Kiraka went to check the door, and barely a few moments later, a girl with dark blonde hairs in a shag cut entered the room with tears in her gray eyes, causing Yuka to watch her with surprise. "Kian? What's going on?" The girl had to take a few long breaths before she could speak, clearly having rushed there as fast as she could, and then finally said, her voice cracking as she said, The Central 46 has declared Rukia guilty, and said she's to be executed within 3 days." As silence descended on the room, Uriah couldn't help but feel like he was in some kind of dark comedy. It just figured that, the very moment they'd managed to find an ally, things had suddenly gotten worse. The feeling of a dark force acting against them while mocking their efforts was strong, but he collected himself. Things might have gotten harder, but so long as a chance remained to save their friend, he was going to do his best to save her, no matter how difficult it might turn out to be. 50. Setup. Tatsuki looked at the large wooden cart in front of herself with a clear sense of confusion. A food cart? Is that really your solution to getting me inside the Suriadii? Kyokaku shook her head. That's only a part of it, but yes. There is no way to go through the barrier surrounding the Suriadii other than the gates. I don't pretend to understand the mechanics of it, but the way Kayan explained it to me, it is powered by an artifact that predates the Suriadii itself. It's in through the gates, or not at all. Tatsuki kept to herself the comment about how Orium and Uriu, alongside her sensei Yoryuki, had been able to use the special shortcut Aizen had left behind. It wouldn't really help anything to go into an argument about details. Instead she asked the other question she had. "And you're sure they'll let us in? I know that you lot are weird ghosts that need to eat, but I think they'd have food inside the walls already." "They do, but most of that is saved up and stored for emergencies. Most of the people in the Rokanga don't have a soul powerful enough to need feeding, so if they don't take it, the food grown outside the wall will just go bad. They'd rather have it to store than let it rot, you know." "Yeah, but this is an emergency situation. I'd have expected them to close all the doors." Kyokaku shook her head. "It's not that big of an emergency. Yes, you lot made a big ruckus, but you're also just a handful, and couldn't stand up to the Godii if they managed to pin you down. The gates will be guarded, but they won't have sealed them shut. They will likely check the cart, but that's not a problem." Tatsuki frowned at that. "It's not? I'm pretty sure that sneaking me inside won't really be possible if they check the cart over." "That would be right, if I hadn't planned for it already." The one-armed woman offered Tatsuki what looked like a glass orb, about half the size of her skull. She took it with a frown. It was very heavy, yet somehow, it felt like it was empty to her spiritual senses. "What is this?" "Something called a Raishukaku. You need to fill it with your Ryatsu, and it'll match your Ryuryoku signature to itself. You can't use your Ryatsu for anything else while you're using it, but as long as it's active, it lets you hide your Ryatsu. As long as you stay hidden, you'll be invisible." Tatsuki blinked. She wasn't expecting this when she'd been told she'd be sneaking inside. At this point, it seemed clear that the other woman had thought of everything she could already, but Tatsuki still felt compelled to ask, with a smirk. "And I imagine that you have already thought of a way to keep me from being seen. The card has a fake bottom, you'll hide in there, and with the Raishukaku, nobody will be able to sense your presence until we're safely inside the walls." Then Kyokaku's expression turned more serious as she went on. "Once I let you out, however, you'll be on your own. That's why I said this is very dangerous. With the Raishukaku, you'll be able to sneak around, but if even one discover you, it won't take long before you have an entire division to contend with. And all the work I've done to collect the evidence will have been a waste." Tatsuki nodded, tapping her abdomen, where she'd secured the folder with all the information to herself with a tightly wrapped sarashi under her clothes. That way, she wouldn't be worrying about losing it if she had to run or fight, and having to keep her abdomen from being pierced really wasn't a problem. "I'll take care of it, don't worry. See to it, and remember, if you don't, I'll make you regret it." Tatsuki nodded, and then let Kyokaku lead her to the fake bottom of the cart, and hiding within, she closed her eyes, slowly breathing as she let her Ryatsu feel the glass ball in her hand. until Kyokaka confirmed from outside that she couldn't perceive her anymore. Luckily, the actual process of sneaking inside went off without a hitch. It wasn't long before night had fallen, and once it did, Tatsuki started to silently move through the streets, heading for the place where Kyokaka had said the process was taking place. The streets of the Suriadii were empty at night. Only once or twice did Kyokaka had to avoid a Shinigami, but they always looked like they were heading home, rather than patrolling. Overall, Tatsuki thought that she was making good progress when, suddenly, a titanic but very familiar-looking dragon of ice rose above the buildings to her left. She stared, immediately hiding to see if somebody would react to it, but when nobody did, she suddenly realized that no sound was coming from the area the dragon was in. Even as it slammed into a wall and caused a portion of it to collapse, it caused no sound at all. It seemed that somebody was somehow trying to keep the fight from attracting attention. That never would have worked in the middle of the day, but at night, with no people around and that silencing effect engaged, it would take until somebody actually saw the fight for them to realize it was going on. With a muttered curse, Tatsuki changed her direction, heading toward the fight as fast as he possibly could. That ice dragon was the power of the Shinigami she'd fought earlier, and that meant that he was likely attacking another one of her friends. Last time, she'd had to escape because he got reinforcements, but that didn't look likely this time, and she was not going to let any of her friends in danger if she could get to them in time. After all, she told to herself, she'd practically beaten the white-haired pretty boy once already. Doing it again was, if anything, going to be fun. She could even feel the fires of her inner hollow growing hotter at the idea, but she didn't let it stop her. She was in full control, and this time would win for sure. As he woke up, feeling himself wrapped into something somewhat tight, Ichigo immediately went to a seated position, startled for a moment at the idea of being once again trapped by Shiro's powers. The material around him yielded easily, proving itself to merely be blankets, but the movement also dislodged something from his face that fell onto his lap. Ichigo was surprised by it and turned the item in his hands, realizing it was half of his hollow mask. Had he been wearing it the whole time he was unconscious? He went to check himself for wounds, and found that they seemed gone, and also that he was covered in a number of glowing constructs whose use he didn't understand and wasn't sure what to do with. He poked one with a finger, which caused a small wave of Ryotsu to ripple out of it. Apparently, this was all that was necessary, as it caused a short and scrawny Shinigami with a nervous look to suddenly enter the room. Once he saw that Ichigo was awake, the boy smiled, looking almost relieved as he did. "So, you recovered. That's good news, your friends will be happy to hear it. What are all of these things?" "Healing Kido, I set them so that the hollow that was trying to take over wouldn't be able to overpower you unless you gave in. Now that you're fine, I can remove them, give me just a moment." While the Shinigami medic got to work, Ichigo considered his words. Was this boy's magic the reason the inner hollow had been unable to kill him directly? If so, he owed him a pretty huge thanks. "What's your name?" "Hanataro Yamada." "Why?" "Just, your Kido helped. If you ever need something from me, just ask, okay?" The boy beamed, apparently very happy at having his work recognized, even as he scratched his head in embarrassment. "Ah, no need to, I just did my part. You'd not be here if you hadn't been strong enough to recover on your own." Before Ichigo could comment about that, Chad entered the room, with Yoriyuki following after him in her cat form. The latter expression was hard to decipher, as usual, due to her animal form, but Ichigo was both glad and a bit guilty at seeing his friend's relieved face upon seeing he was fine. With Chad being his own laconic self, it was Yoriyuki who spoke first, and while her cat face remained unreadable, he could feel something close to satisfaction in her voice. "Nice to see you're up again. We were worried the hollow was going to take over there for a bit." Ichigo looked down at the mask fragment in his lap and commented, half to himself. "It tried, but all it ended up doing was give me a better way to control it, but also a lot of doubts on whether I should. I feel like I should keep it as a last resort." Yoriyuki sounded curious about that, as she jumped on top of the bed, sitting herself at the feet of it as she asked. "Why? Are you worried about something?" He shook his head, unsure how to answer, and that was when he realized he was waiting for some sort of counsel on how to handle the matter that wasn't coming. He looked around his bed, his brows furrowing as he failed to find what he was looking for, and he had to ask the others. Where is my Zanpakuto? Your sword was taken by Captain Ichimaru, and I'm afraid that's the least of the bad news. Ichigo turned toward Izuru at the tone of his words, where the blonde Shinigami, who'd entered just after Chad and was looking just as grim as he'd sounded. Ichigo could feel a sense of dread creeping on him at that. What do you mean? It was Yoriyuki who answered, sounding just as set as Izuru had. He means that Kisuke was captured, and that two of Izuru's and Rukia's friend, Renji Abarai and Momo Hinamori, were also arrested. Ichigo grimaced at being told that Renji had been arrested for helping him in his escape, but before he could comment, Yoriyuki continued. And, the Central 46 has delivered their verdict for Rukia. They found her guilty, and have decreed she will be executed 3 days from now. Ichigo froze at that, and then could feel anger slowly growing in his soul. What? They've decided already? There must be something we can do to change that. Izuru shook his head at that. They have delivered the verdict, but they're still sealed away in the council chamber. Apparently, they decided that your attempt to free Rukia from prison both proved her guilt and was a precursor to an attack, so the entire council will not allow anybody to contact them until you all are captured and the execution has took place. Ichigo clenched his fists, the cloth of his blankets almost ripping before he took a long breath, calming himself as he mustered all of his determination. Right, then I guess we're going to break her out. Maybe they'll listen to our side then. Chad nodded, his eyes showing that he matched Ichigo's determination with his own, while Izuru let out a resigned breath. Yoriyuki, for her own part, offered a eager grin, which was quite the thing for a cat to manage. Hanataro, however, let out a surprised gasp and asked, disbelieving. You're going to go against a ruling of the Central 46. That's almost like declaring war on all of Seoul society. Do you have any idea what that even means? Ichigo was surprised at the doctor's words. Didn't you already know we were going against them? But that was when you were trying to present evidence that might overturn a case. You might have been forced to go about it in a non-conventional manner, but it was still working within the system. This would be going fully against it. It's completely different. Ichigo didn't really see any difference at all. He was trying to correct an injustice and fighting for his friends, just like he'd been the whole time. But then again, it wasn't like this was his society he was fighting against, and besides that, it wasn't really the boys' fight. Thus, he reached to pat the Shinigami, who was now looking like a nervous wreck a few moments away from a heart attack, on his shoulder and told him, in a reassuring tone. It's fine, we're not going to tell anybody you helped us, and you can just leave while we're planning things so you won't have to lie or keep our secrets for us. You've already done enough. Without the help of your spells, my inner hollow would have devoured me. Saving my life was enough help for me. Izuru nodded at that and added, in an encouraging tone. Yeah, after that, you really don't owe me anything anymore, Hanataro. I'm not going to ask you to join us in rebellion or anything like that. All debts are settled as far as I'm concerned. Hanataro's eyes moved from one to the other of them, taking in the entire group, until he finally asked, in a whisper. But you're going to go ahead with it anyway, aren't you? Ichigo nodded, Chad echoing the movement himself and speaking up as well. Facing the impossible to save each other is what friends are for. Hanataro looked even more shocked and nervous after that, but Ichigo once again squeezed his shoulder in reassurance, and at that, he let out a long breath and spoke in a hesitant tone. I won't rat you out. I'll just sit in the corner and listen, in case you need another opinion or something. He followed his words with action, moving to sit in a chair, while Ichigo refocused his attention on the others, Izuru in particular. So, I guess we'll need to go for a straight-up prison break now? Head straight for Rukia, get her out before the date of the execution. Izuru shook his head at that, and said. That might not be as easy as you imagine. While everybody else is being held in the cells of our division, Rukia has been moved to the palace, so now is the royal guards guarding her. Ichigo frowned at that. I guess that makes harder, but we knew going in this wasn't going to be easy. Yes, but it'd be even harder if we need to scour the entire compound for her instead of heading straight for her cell and leaving quickly. What's more, we really can't take the 1st Division head on. We need to find out where she's been held first, and reinforcement wouldn't be amiss. Reinforcement like my friends in Urahara Kisuk, thanks to them being held in the 3rd Division's detention area, I know exactly how to get them out faster. Ichigo blinked at that. While he didn't know Izuru's other friend Momo, he appreciated that she'd been willing to help Rukia enough to be arrested for it, and he had some genuine respect for both Renji and Kisuk, the first for his combat prowess and the latter for his brilliance. He had no plans to let them rot in jail. That didn't make it any true that, to him, saving them seemed less urgent. If we do that though, don't we risk to alert the Godai to our plan? The first place we attack is the only one where we'll have the element of surprise, and while I want to save everybody, Rukia is in danger of dying if we take too long. Yuriuki spoke up then, in a more serious tone. I think any element of surprise is already gone, they were expecting me when I went to spring Rukia the first time around. But if any of it were left, using it to ensure that the easier attempt becomes a surefire thing, which also makes the bigger hurdle a bit smaller, is the smarter move. And, it will make for an excellent distraction while I recover the means to pinpoint Rukia's location. What means? Her Zanpakuto. Ichigo was left confused by that. How does having Sode no Shirayuki would help us learn where Rukia is being held? Yuriuki smacked her tail against his leg, then said, in a lecturing tone. Because of the connection, a Zanpakuto is a part of the Shinigami, a piece of their soul, no matter how far apart they are, or what obstacles are in the way. Try for yourself if you don't believe me, close your eyes, focus, and reach for your own Zanpakuto, and you should be able to locate it. Ichigo blinked, but then closed his eyes, regulating his breathing as he tried to locate his connection to his Zanpakuto. Initially, he wasn't sure what to look for, but then, he realized he was feeling a very faint sense of loss inside his soul. Concentrating on it, he felt as if he could tell how it could be filled, and when he focused on that, he got a strong sense of the direction he had to head towards to fill it, as well as how far he'd need to go to achieve it. He opened his eyes, and realized he'd turned his head while looking for his connection. Izuru chuckled at that and commented. Yes, that's the direction the 3rd Division's barracks are located at. I know where the confiscated swords are, both yours and those of the others, but the room itself is shielded from perception, much like the walls of the palace where Rukia is being kept, yet you can feel its position anyway. Ichigo could see how this would work. Do we know where Sode no Shirayuki is then? Izuru nodded, but it was Yuriuki who answered. Byakuya has it. That's why I can go retrieve it on my own. I've been at his mansion a great many times. With you attacking the prison to keep any reinforcements he could call in occupied, I'll have no trouble retrieving it. The mention of Rukia's brother had sweat forming on Ichigo's body at the mere memory of how easily the man had bested him. He knew that Yuriuki was stronger than himself, but it still seemed risky for her to try and burglarize his home on her own. What if Rukia's brother intercepts you, or has the sword on his person? Don't worry, strong as he might be, I know everything he was taught, and more besides, anything he can do, I can counter. Izuru frowned at that, and asked. What of his Zanpakuto? I've never seen it myself, the man is secretive, but Renji mentioned he tried his own against it once, and according to him, that Zanpakuto's power is formidable. How can you be sure you can take it on? Yuriuki stretched, clearly unconcerned with the problem. Oh, I've seen it in action. He has a mind-type Zanpakuto that allows him to control the sword with his mind, even when it is out of his sight. It's useful in that it allows him to continue fighting even when paralyzed or otherwise impaired, and I guess it grants him some extra awareness of the area around the blade, since he doesn't need to know where it is to control it, but I'm far too fast for that to stop me. Ichigo couldn't help but think that such a power would not have given much trouble to Renji, considering his Shikai, certainly not enough for the redhead to call it formidable. It might still be wise to take some backup, just in case he has a surprise. If nothing else, you don't know what his Bankai is, do you? No, but Bankai are generally too destructive to use indoors, and in any case, the goal is to make the breakout a sure thing, so the group doing that should have as much combat power as possible. She paused, turning toward Ichigo with an inquisitive gaze, whiskers flickering. Speaking of which, will you be able to fight without your Zanpakuto? Ichigo frowned at the question. He'd faced off Shiro without one, and had enough tricks by now that he should be able to fight well enough, but even so, Facing Zanpakuto wielding Shinigami without one of his own was not something he would be looking forward to. And if the rest of his tricks didn't work, then trying to command Shiro would be all he had left, and he wasn't at all confident he could do that properly, and losing control might mean letting the Hollow gain control of both Ichigo's body and the Hujioku at once. That was a terrifying possibility to confront. As Ichigo nodded in answer to Yoriyuki, Chad seemed to sense his hesitation. Is something the matter? Ichigo grimaced, but he couldn't lie to his friend, so he explained. I just worry that I might be forced to rely on my inner Hollow's power, which is a big risk to take. There might be another possibility. Seeing that Ichigo was both surprised and confused by his point, Chad went on to elaborate. You can awaken an item with Fullbring. It will at least give you one more card to play before you need to rely on the Hollow. Ichigo hadn't even considered it. He'd learned a bit of how Fullbringer worked from his fights with Jinjo and the rest, but he'd not really considered the possibility to actually focus on it. Are you sure I can even manage it, Chad? I know you can, I'll teach you how. Though you hadn't mastered your awakened item yet. Chad shook his head. I haven't, but not because I don't know how. My item will take time to master because of what it is. He pointed to the golden pendant at his neck, the one Ichigo knew had once belonged to his grandfather. The pendant wants to wrap myself in a protective embrace, but its soul is not strong enough to do that on its own. It needs me to feed it the Ryotsu to do it every time I awaken it. Chad turned the item in his fingers, looking down at it for a moment, a contemplative gleam in his eyes. I can't yet control the large quantity of Ryotsu it needs at once, which limits it. And it's also a matter of the quality of emotion I feed it. We both want to protect things, that's why the emotion is enough to awaken it, but we desire to protect different things, so we aren't fully in harmony. I will need to achieve that with the pendant before it can release its full potential for me. He then looked up at Ichigo, letting the pendant go as he pointed a finger at him instead. Mastery is difficult, but taking the first step isn't. Just let me guide you. All right. Ichigo nodded, and Chad then said, in a more focused expression. Awakening an item is similar to using Fullbring, in that you need to push your Ryotsu and emotions into something. The big difference is that, instead of telling the item what to do, you need to give it the power to do what it, itself, wants to do. You do that by knowing the emotion the item will feel, and match it with your own. Ichigo blinked. That sounded surprisingly easy, actually. Although, how would you know what emotions you need to match inside the item? Chad smiled at that, and answered. That's even easier, you need to genuinely and very strongly feel the same emotion for the item that it feels toward you. With the right item, it comes naturally. Ichigo was left doubtful by that. So how do you pick the right item then? You don't. When you are feeling the right emotion, it becomes self-evident. Ichigo was pretty sure that Chad could see he wasn't getting it, but his friend didn't let that stop him. Instead, he placed an hand on Ichigo's own, while with the other he took his necklace and said, You know what this pendant means to me. It is the last gift from my abuelo, that he gave me to help me remember about him, and his words about my strength being there to protect others, just like my abuelo, himself, did all he could in his life to protect me. The desire of protect is what connects us, because when I think of protecting something, I think of my abuelo, and think of his last gift, while this pendant was given to me as a memento of that desire of protecting, and thus carried the emotion within itself, strengthening it every time I experienced protecting something, especially as I protected it. That was, Ichigo admitted to himself, a lot more wordy than his friend would normally be. Maybe it was because of the unusual loquacity that Ichigo could feel the emotions vibrating in Chad's words, but he had a strong suspicion that they would have been there anyway. And it made sense, what he was saying, but it just caused Ichigo to lower his head as he failed to find within himself anything that could match the kind of heartfelt emotion Chad was speaking of. I don't think I really have any item that symbolizes that kind of deep emotion for me though. I think you do. Ichigo turned a puzzled look to Chad, and his friend went on. You said you need something to fight, so you're feeling powerless, and with a need to gain power. But you have felt like that before, haven't you? Found yourself in a situation when you got the power you needed, when you went from the feeling of desperately needing that power, to the elation of having it. Ichigo was surprised when Chad's question immediately brought to mind the moment when Rukia had given him his power, and almost instinctively, his hand went to his belt, resting on the handle of the broken ashwal, the very item that had been the source of his power, letting him go from powerless to powerful, a number of times. In fact, he realized, even after it broke he'd kept it with himself, perhaps because, on an unconscious level, the item symbolized that feeling of no longer feeling powerless anymore, and he'd even found times to make use of it in battle during emergencies, many more times of going from powerless to powerful. He let out a long breath at that, glancing down at the item and then back at Chad. And you think this would work? Won't know until you try, but let me tell you this. Whenever I use my power to protect people, it felt right to me, like I was doing what I was always meant to do. I take pride in it, in this ability I have to keep those I care about safe. Have you ever felt like that, about having your powers? The feeling of accomplishment, that what you're doing is the right thing and you're proud of doing it. Ichigo smiled at that, a small thing, more of amusement than happiness, but he could see what Chad was getting to, and nodded. Then, he closed his eyes, closing his hand around the Oswald's handle, and then focused on the emotion, the feeling of going from powerless to powerful, the pride and sense of rightness in using that power. He did it again and again, losing himself in the depth of it, until it was so strong, it started to make his limbs feel heavier, and his head ache. Normally, he would have just tried to think of something else, but now, he instead focused on it as a Ryutsu construct, and pushed it down his arm and through his hand, into the broken sword he was wielding. And the weapon took it, almost seeming to suck the emotion away from Ichigo, leaving him lightheaded, while it seemed to grow fuller with it, fatter, only to erupt with the power a moment later. Ichigo could feel the inert Reishi the blade was made of suddenly becoming active, the emotions within reacting and sparking with a life they'd not had before, like a powerful volcano suddenly awoken from a long slumber. Ichigo opened his eyes then, and drew the sword, and he could see it had changed now, looking fully repaired and in the same shape it had been before breaking, a dato with a black blade and a crossguard sporting 4 prongs bent into the shape of the manji symbol, a small chain dangling from the pommel. A sense of nostalgia filled him for a moment, but he pushed it away as he studied the weapon, trying to understand what the churning sense of its Ryutsu he was getting meant, and once he did, his eyes widened in surprise. What? He chuckled, and answered in a wondering tone. The sword, it's collecting power from the air, loose Ryutsu, drawing it in and condensing it to give itself more density. Every moment I let it grows a small sliver stronger. It was, he recognized, the same process by which Zanpakuto would make themselves denser and able to cut through most things, except the Oswald was doing it automatically. And not only that, he could feel that the power was not merely being collected to make it cut better, but also being kept ready, as if the increased cutting power was a byproduct, and the collection and storing of power was meant for some other, greater purpose. He tried to figure out which one, and while he couldn't, the mere act of thinking it seemed to spark a sense of recognition from the blade. He couldn't interpret the explanation completely, but he got a sense of grandiosity, of a power great enough to cut through the doors to paradise themselves, should they be barred to it. It wasn't easy to put into words, but the feeling was unmistakable, because it wasn't so far off from what Ichigo felt when he thought of what he'd do for his friends. Well, isn't that ambitious? What is? You're not making much sense here. Ichigo turned toward Izuru, who was the one who had asked the question, and answered him with a grin. The sword, it is ambitious. It seems to have a pretty cocky personality. Is it like a Zanpakuto then? With a mind of its own? Ichigo considered what he was feeling from the thing, then shook his head. No, not quite, it's not at that level of sentience, more like some sort of pet. But it was smart enough to give me a name for itself, so there's that. This seemed to finally move Yoriyuki to comment herself, sounding clearly curious. What name is that? Getsuga Tensho, the sword that will pierce the heavens. Well, I guess that means you will be able to handle any fights you get into well enough then. Ichigo nodded, letting the sword go back to a sleeping state, which caused it to also return to its previously broken form. As he sheathed it, Chad offered him a thumb up as he did, and Ichigo's smile grew as he nodded to his friend in thanks for his help. That's right, let's do this. Toshiro wasn't sure why the hallways of the detention area were empty, but he honestly didn't particularly care right now. He had a person he needed to talk with and get answers from, and not having anybody to bother him about protocols and such was more a relief than anything else. When he reached the corridor with the cells, it was Renji who noted him first, and quickly got up, looking quite surprised. "Toshiro? What are you doing here?" He let out a long breath, not wanting to deal with this right now, and answered. "I'm here to speak with Momo." "Please, Renji, stay out of this." Momo herself had been sitting with her back to the entrance, looking to the ground, but when she heard Renji call his name, and then his own voice, she turned suddenly, surprise and disbelief written on her face, before being suddenly replaced by a hopeful smile. "Toshiro! You're here!" Then she jumped to her feet, rushing to the prison's bars and grabbing them with an excited face. "I'm so glad to see you. I heard you were in a fight. You didn't get hurt, did you?" He let out another long breath, then shook his head and fixed on her as serious of an expression as he could manage, which caused Momo to take a step back in shock. "What are you doing, Momo?" "Captain Swaifo said she found you helping a traitor infiltrate their prison, and then your own captain said you were housing 2 more inside your own house. You realize that's a betrayal of all that we stand for, don't you?" Momo quickly shook her head, tears forming into her eyes. "No, Toshiro, it's not like that." "It isn't? So the captains were lying, is that what you mean to say?" She didn't answer immediately, clearly looking guilty. Toshiro would have been able to read it in her body language and posture even if she hadn't been feeling the emotion so strongly as to be unable to hide it. He merely sighed at that. "So they weren't. Why, Momo? I thought we shared the same dream, to do what we could from within the Godiai to make life better for the people of Rukanga. Have you forgotten all about that? Or was it all a lie to begin with?" That caused a reaction, Momo's head snapping up with disbelief written all over it, mixed with desperation and perhaps the barest hint of anger. Her emotions were in such turmoil that only thought the experience born of years growing up together could he manage to make sense of them. She slammed her fists against the bar, crying. I didn't forget, and I never lied to you, Toshiro. I still want to help, I was trying to." Toshiro could see that Momo genuinely believed that, if nothing else. He put a hand to his forehead, letting out another sigh, and asked. "How? Momo, how could you think this would help anything? I can't understand what you're doing if you don't explain to me why you're doing it." She faltered at that, then said, hesitant. I don't know if you'll believe me. I don't want you to think I'm a liar, I promise I'm not. But I have no proof and... Momo trailed off, as if unsure how to explain what she was feeling, but Toshiro thought he could understand. She was worried that, if he thought she was lying, it'd destroy their friendship. Toshiro wasn't sure what to think about such a thing himself. In truth, he wanted to believe that nothing Momo could tell him would ever be enough to cause such a rift between them, but he had no idea what secret she was hiding. In the end, the words of Captain Anohana came back to him, and he gently reached through the bars to place a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder, and told her, in a soft tone. "Momo, it's fine, just tell me the truth. I cannot help you, and I cannot understand, until you tell me what is actually going on." She leaned into the touch, as if drawing strength from the contact, then steeled herself. He could feel the muscles in her body contracting as she gathered her courage, and then she said. "Rukia is innocent, as are Captain Shihoan, and Lieutenant Urahara. They were framed by a traitor. That is what Rukia was investigating in the material realm, on behalf of Captain Aizen. That's what he was about to testify about, and why he was killed, because the traitor found out, and covered his tracks. That's why I'm helping Rukia's friends, and why I asked Renji to help them too, because I knew they all were only trying to help the Godiai 13. Just like I am." Toshiro was left stunned by that. It was a pretty huge thing to say, especially if Momo had no proof of it, but since it was Momo saying it, he knew she truly believed it. Maybe she might have been misled, but if so, it had to be innocent on her part. He knew firsthand how persuading the invaders could be from his interaction with Urahara. And that was when he felt his blood go as cold as the ice he commanded, and a sense of dread slowly crept up on him. It couldn't be, could it? What Momo was insinuating, the same cursed doubt that Urahara had provoked in him during their last conversation. She looked into Momo's eyes, trying to find confusion there, anything that could help him believe she had been tricked somehow, but all that was there was a deep sadness for Toshiro himself, he distantly realized, mixed with the same fear that he knew was reflected in his own. And then, a voice cut the oppressively growing silence, the tone amused and carefree as if talking of the weather. Now, those are some serious accusation to level with such a lack of evidence, Miss Hinamori. You do not think a member in good standing of the 3rd Division like Lieutenant Hichugaya would let himself be waylaid so easily, do you? Momo stepped back, her fear replaced by pure terror as her gaze moved in the direction the voice had been coming from. Toshiro did the same, all of his attention on the familiar smirk, slitted eyes, silver hairs, and lazy gait of Captain Ichimaru as he made his way to them, looking completely unhurried and relaxed. Toshiro had no idea how to react, so he reacted reflexively, using propriety to shield the maelstroms of doubts and confusing emotion he was engulfed by. Captain! Why are you here at this late hour? Captain Ichimaru tilted his head slightly at that, answering in the usual amused tone. I could ask you the same, Lieutenant, couldn't I? After all, I did not order you to be here. Then, before Toshiro could answer to that, Captain Ichimaru raised a finger to stop him, and went on. But I suppose I might as well tell you, I am here because I am waiting for the rest of the invaders. I am sure they will soon come to save their co-conspirators, and when they do, I shall be here, ready for them. That had not occurred to Toshiro as a possibility, but made perfect sense for the way Captain Ichimaru thought. He'd told him a number of times that to win one had to let the enemy step into the position you wanted them to of their own accord, rather than trying to force them there yourself. While Toshiro was somewhat calmed by those words, they were just what Momo needed to break out of her fear, and not in a good manner. You monster! You're the one responsible for having Rukia condemned to death. You murdered Captain Aizen. How many more people do you plan to kill? Captain Ichimaru's smirk turned slightly sharper, the one Toshiro recognized as marking his captain's amusement as taking a darker edge, not quite annoyance but still less than happy, his tone mocking. Those are some serious accusations you are making, Miss Hinamori. I'd ask if you had proof, but you don't, do you? Rukia wouldn't lie to me about this. Such trust in your friends. Tell me, did you trust your dear Captain Aizen that much as well? Momo looked confused at the question, which matched how Toshiro felt. He had no idea what Captain Ichimaru was aiming for, but everything he did was generally for a reason, so he simply waited, while his captain continued to speak. Because, you see, you've just told Lieutenant Hichugaya, here, that I am this evil monster that is going around murdering people, betraying Soul Society, keeping my real motives hidden. I'm curious to know how you would feel, if I told you all of these things about Aizen? If I told you he was the evil monster, going around murdering people, betraying Soul Society, keeping his real motives hidden. That's a lie. You're lying. Captain Ichimaru shrugged at that, his smile self-assured, as he answered. But you aren't? Why is it that when it's you and your captain, it is false, but when it's Lieutenant Hichugaya and his captain, it is true? Why should he believe you, rather than me? Momo was crying now, her eyes having moved away from Captain Ichimaru to refocus on Toshiro himself as she pleaded, her fists shaking in a mix of rage and desperation. Please, Toshiro, I would never lie to you. I wouldn't. To which Captain Ichimaru replied, amused. But I would, is that what you're saying? He shook his head, and then asked, something dark entering his voice that Toshiro had never heard from Captain Ichimaru before. I have it in good authority that you admired Aizen before of how understanding he was, how much he cared. What if neither of us was lying, and it was because he cared that he became the murderer I'm calling him out as? Would you still be at his side, if that was the case? Ready to face me, if we were both betraying the Goti I-13? Toshiro had no idea what that was about, and Momo looked just as confused, but from one of the neighboring cells, Urahara's voice calm, sharp and angry. Stop insulting my captain, you madman, I won't let dash. Captain Ichimaru waved in hand, and a thin, almost invisible barrier glowing golden only along the edges appeared in front of Urahara's cell. Akido Toshiro couldn't cast himself with such facility, but which he recognized as a silencing barrier, meant to keep all sounds on one side of it from passing through. Captain Ichimaru turned an amused chuckle at Urahara upon seeing him frown at being silenced, but then returned his attention to Momo and asked, pressing, "So, what is the answer to my question, Miss Hinamori? Would you still defend Aizen, fight by his side, if he was the man I'm saying he was, rather than the one you think him?" Momo glowered at that, apparently having found her courage in the brief time Captain Ichimaru had been focused on Urahara, and shouted back, "I don't care about your lies. I would stand by Captain Aizen because he would never act as you did. If he was anything like you, I'd never have admired him at all in the first place. You won't get me to admit that helping you would be right if you were him, because it wouldn't be at all." Captain Ichimaru's smirk turned to a smaller, more genuine smile, and for a moment, Toshiro thought that to mean that Momo had passed whatever test she was been put under, and maybe now Captain Ichimaru would provide a proper explanation that would make sense, rather than one forcing him to choose between his adopted sister and his mentor and idol. However, when Captain Ichimaru spoke in a relaxed, almost peaceful tone, saying, "Well, I did ask," all of Toshiro's nerves went into overdrive, and he jumped, drawing his sword before he even could think, dashing forward with a push of his best shunpo, and even with that, as his sword struck and redirected Captain Ichimaru's own, all he managed was to keep the blade from killing Momo. It still let a bleeding cut on her cheek, even as the 3 bars it had severed clattered to the ground. Toshiro placed himself between Momo and her attacker, glaring at the silver-haired man as he shouted, letting his fury grow within him and give him the courage to challenge the man he admired. "Captain, what is the meaning of this? What do you think you're doing?" The man gestured with his shrunken sword, his smirk growing somewhat mocking. "Well, when the invaders came to break them out, of course it degenerated into a fight. Sadly, Miss Hinamori got killed in the fighting." "Why? Why do all this?" The smirk turned genuine at that, a smile that Toshiro had never seen on those lips before. "Everything I do is to ensure a better future for all of the Soul Society. Rakonga, Suriatii, the Godii, the 46 families, everyone. That is the only truth I can give you. The choice on believing it or not, however, is one only you can make. So, what will it be?" Toshiro could feel Momo holding her breath behind him, while the man he was facing was in a relaxed posture, as if uncaring of what Toshiro would decide. He took a breath, and then answered that question in the only way he could. "Freeze the heavens, higher in Meru." The ice erupted even as his sword morphed into its Shikai shape, the titanic dragon of ice slamming past the bars before wrapping itself around Toshiro and Momo both before smashing through the prison's walls. As he constructed a flat fin on the dragon's body for Momo to hold on, he saw a black and white silhouette with silver hairs jumping through the hole he'd made and landing onto the roof. Immediately, he had the body of the dragon slam into the roof, collapsing a portion of it while his enemy moved to land on the large, open court of the prison, and then said, in a dark tone, "I never thought it would be like this, but I've always wanted to beat you, Jin. It's time for it to happen." Jin laughed and answered, sounding as if he was enjoying himself. "What happened to calling me Captain Ichimaru, Toshiro? Have you lost all respect for me now? You don't deserve any." And with that thought, Toshiro prepared himself. He might have wanted to prove himself against his mentor, but to do so was not going to be easy at all. Still, as he glanced at a terrified Momo right next to himself, his resolve hardened. Whatever the cost, he'd made his choice now, and would stick to it, no matter the cost. Izura was carefully leading them through the prison hallways. So far, everything had proceeded without surprises, yet Ichigo couldn't help but feel that something was wrong with it. It was the silence, mostly. The lack of any guard anywhere was unsettling. In a sense, it meant that Izura was right, and Jin truly was planning to use Ichigo's sword as a lure and had set up a trap of some sort, but knowing the fight was coming did not make the fact they'd have to face the man who had somehow managed to overcome Ichigo's hollow regeneration any less terrifying. In an effort to chase away the feeling, he turned to the last member of the group, who was trailing after them at a more sedate pace. "So, Hanataro, you sure you don't want to change your mind and head back? We're clearly walking into a trap of some sort here, and you don't need to join us into it." It had been a surprise when the medic had chosen to accompany them, citing the fact that, with Jin's ability to inflict wounds that were so hard to recover from, they might need to have a medic ready at hand, a blatant excuse, even if one with enough tactical relevance that Izuru and Yoriyuki had accepted it. But Ichigo could see that it was something else that motivated the Shinigami. He was trembling in clear nervousness, probably the most affected of the group by the silence, yet he determinedly put one step after the other and continued to follow along. Ichigo's question did made him look up, startled. He normally walked with his eyes firmly fixed on the ground, giving him something of an hunched posture. As he understood Ichigo's question, his eyes widened like a deer in the headlight. Considering how he already had pretty big eyes to begin with, the thing made him seem almost like a kid caught into some misdeed. After a moment, though, he asked, hesitant. You really meant what you said, right? That to be a friend means to be ready to do all you can to help those you care about. Ichigo's eyes widened at that, and he answered, a bit of worry forming in his gut. That's what I think, yes, and I honestly mean it. But that doesn't mean you should do something you aren't happy to do just because other people are doing it. Hanataro considered the words, but before he could answer, there was a sudden sound of brick suddenly collapsing from far ahead, that caused the whole group to froze for a moment, and then start rushing, heading for the place the sound was coming from, which, as they arrived, proved to be the holding cells they had been heading for. What they found there was a cell that had been completely demolished, several of the bars on its door had been cut down, one of the walls had been collapsed, and the ceiling had a huge hole in it. Luckily, nobody seemed to be inside, and the two cells next to it were occupied by a surprised Renji and Urahara, the latter apparently trying to say something but being prevented from doing so. Izuru immediately rushed to free them even as he asked, hurried. What's going on? Toshiro is fighting Jin. He'd come here to talk with Momo, but then Jin showed up to say he was waiting here because he knew you showed up, then tried to murder Momo, but Toshiro got in the way. Now they're fighting outside. Ichigo nodded, turning toward the breach. Alright then, let's go help them then. Wait. Ichigo turned toward Urahara, who was now out of his cell, and the scientist said, in a serious tone. A number of us are unarmed, joining right now, we might be more liabilities that help. But, since Jin is facing Hitsugaya, that means our Zanpakuto must have been left unsupervised now. If they're close enough, we should go get them before we join in. We'd have a better chance that way. Ichigo grimaced at the idea of leaving somebody who was apparently enough of an ally to have risked his life for one of Rukia's friends alone against Jin, but Urahara had a point, so he focused on the direction he could feel his Zanpakuto being hidden at. He let out a brief breath of relief when he realized they weren't far, and immediately took point. It's this way, just follow me, everyone. They did, and after passing 3 crossroads, taking left twice and right once, they found themselves in front of a small, reinforced and locked door. Izuru immediately went to open it, his keys working seamlessly. Chad and Renji both helped in pushing the large, heavy door until it finally slid to the side. Inside, Ichigo immediately found his sword, sitting on a shelf next to 3 more, 2 of which he recognized as Renji's and Urahara's. However, something else was in the room that immediately caught his attention, as well as that of everybody else, as the riot so that had been sealed into the room washed over them with enough strength to cause everybody's breath to hitch for a moment. Slowly, the man that was sitting in the middle of the room got to his feet, his figure towering over the group as the white haori he was wearing seemed to billow for a moment from the movement. He cricked his head to the side, the sound of bells lightly tingling as black hairs fashioned in long spikes brushed the ceiling, and then a wide, bloodthirsty grin appeared on a long face with pronounced cheekbones, the one eye that wasn't covered by a dark eye patch glinting with an excitement that was made fearsome by the long scar next to it and the lack of eyebrows. That terrifying, predatory eye seemed to take everybody in turn, and then a large, muscular hand reached for the 4 Zanpakuto behind himself, and grabbed them in a solid grip as the man spoke, his voice like boulders cracking together. Well, would you look at that, Jin's idea of laying in wait for a trap actually worked. I'll need to thank him later. So, let's see what we have. 2 of the fearsome invaders, one of which being the visored Jin identified himself, former Lieutenant Urahara, the famous trickster, Kukaki's lieutenant, who once was of my own, Jin's very own first seat, and even a medic to help you lot keep going whenever I fail to kill somebody. His grin grew larger, terrifyingly so, as he threw their Zanpakuto to them, Ichigo catching the lot in his arms, while he drew his own sword in his other hand, moving it to a guard position as he said, sounding eager in a manner that sent shivers down Ichigo's spine. I am Zaraki Kenpei, and you lot better make this fun. I've been looking forward to it for a while now. Check the description for the links to the author.